The Hargrove name will continue.
It already has. Then you don't need me anymore.
The room had gone quiet in that particular way. That means everyone heard, and no one is going to say so. 200 people, crystal glasses. A rooftop in Chicago in February. The kind of cold outside that made the city look polished, like something someone had buffed to a shine and left out to impress visitors. Inside it was warm. It was always warm at these events. Winston made sure of that. He made sure of everything. Margaret Calloway Hargrove stood near the bar with a glass of sparkling water she had been holding for 40 minutes. Her feet ached. Her back ached. The baby had been pressing against her right side since 6 o'clock and had not let up. 7 months along, 37 years old. In a navy gown that Winston had selected from a rack at the boutique on Michigan Avenue 3 weeks ago, pointing at it while she stood there and saying simply, "That one." She had worn it. She was good at this. 6 years of practice had made her very good at this. She knew the names of the board members' wives. She knew their children's schools. She knew who drank too much at these events and needed to be gently redirected toward a conversation that would absorb them. She knew who needed to feel important and who needed to feel included and who needed someone to say, "I've been following your work," even if it was only partially true. She had made herself indispensable in a way that was never acknowledged, never credited, never visible on any document or any letterhead or any year-end report. She was Winston Hargrove's wife. That was the sum of it. Winston was at the podium now. He did this every year. A toast, a speech, a performance of gratitude that was really a performance of power. She had heard 4 of these speeches. She could have written the 5th herself. He thanked the team first, then the board, then the investors, then the city of Chicago, which always drew a polite laugh. Then he paused, and the room settled into that particular anticipatory silence that followed a Winston Hargrove pause, because in her husband's world, even his silences had a reputation. And of course, he said, "My family." She lifted her glass slightly. A reflex, an old habit from the first 2 galas, when she had thought he meant her, when she had expected him to look at her. He had looked at her then. She remembered it, the warmth of it, how she had held onto it for days afterward. He did not look at her now. He said something else. She caught the beginning of it, and then she lost the thread because she was watching his eyes, which had moved very deliberately to a spot near the east wall of the room. She turned her head. Delia Price was standing near the east wall in a green dress, dark-haired, 31 years old, 6 months pregnant. Maggie had met Delia at 3 company events over the past 2 years. Winston had introduced her each time as his head of investor relations. She was good at her job, everyone said so. She was professional and precise and slightly formal in that way, that felt like someone who had built a careful distance between themselves and the world and maintained it at significant personal cost. Maggie had always liked her. She looked back at Winston. He was still talking. The words were shaped to be deniable. She understood this in the way you understand something, before you understand it, before the understanding has fully assembled itself into a thought you can name. He was talking about the future of the Hargrove name, about legacy, about the continuation of something that mattered. His eyes moved back to Delia. The room understood. 200 people, standing with their crystal glasses and their catered food and their knowledge of exactly what this moment meant, chose simultaneously and collectively to understand it and to say nothing about it and to continue standing in their places as though nothing had shifted. Everything had shifted. Maggie looked at the bar. She looked at her sparkling water. She looked at the bartender, who was looking very carefully at the bottles behind him. She set her glass on the bar, very gently. It made no sound. She said, "Excuse me," to no one in particular. She walked to the elevator. She did not run. She did not let her pace change. She kept her shoulders level and her head up, and she walked with exactly the same bearing she had walked in with 3 hours ago, and she pressed the elevator button, and she waited, and the doors opened, and she stepped inside. The doors closed. She looked at herself in the mirrored wall of the elevator. 37 years old, 7 months pregnant, navy gown, $4,000. Chosen by someone who had been at the moment of choosing, already living in a different future than the one he had offered her. The elevator descended, 42 floors. She counted them. She did not cry. Not yet. She was not ready to cry yet because crying would make it real, and it was already real enough that she was not sure she could afford to make it any more real than it already was. The lobby. The coat check. Her black wool coat, heavy and warm, the one she had chosen herself 2 winters ago at a shop on Wabash. She put it on, she buttoned it. She went outside. The February cold hit her like a hand pressed flat against her face. She stopped for 1 second on the sidewalk. Let it happen. Then she kept moving. The car was waiting, their car, his car. A black SUV with a driver named Carl who had been with the family for 4 years. Carl looked straight ahead when she got in. She was grateful for this. She was grateful for Carl's professional discretion in a way she had never had reason to be before. The hotel on Michigan Avenue, she said. The one near the water. Carl did not ask which hotel. He knew which one. She had mentioned it once, months ago in passing, saying something about the view from the restaurant on the top floor. Carl had the particular quality of good drivers and good assistants. He remembered the things people said when they did not know they were being remembered. The car moved into traffic. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby pressed back. That steady rolling pressure she had been living with for weeks. Familiar now. A conversation she was having with someone she had not yet met. Not your fault, she said quietly. Just above a whisper. None of this is yours. Carl did not react. He was a professional. She was grateful for that, too. She looked out the window. Chicago moved past her, the lights on the lake, the people on the sidewalks moving through the cold with the particular purposeful urgency of people who know where they are going. She watched them and she thought about that, about knowing where you are going, and she thought about the fact that until approximately 22 minutes ago she had believed she knew. She had been so sure, 6 years of being sure. Her phone lit up on the seat beside her. She looked at it. A text from Winston. 4 words, we need to talk. She read it. She picked up the phone. She locked it. She unlocked it. She locked it again. She put it face down on the leather seat. She looked back out the window. The lake was out there somewhere in the dark. She could not see it, but she knew it was there. She had always known things she could not see. That, she was beginning to understand, had been both her greatest strength and her longest-running problem. The car pulled up to the hotel. She got out. The cold again. Her breath in the air. The sound of her heels on the pavement. Then on the marble of the lobby floor, she walked to the front desk. I need a room, she said. Under Calloway. The woman at the desk looked up. She glanced, briefly and involuntarily, at the visible roundness of Maggie's stomach. Then she looked back at her screen with professional neutrality. Of course, she said. How many nights? Maggie thought about this. I'm not sure yet, she said. She used her personal credit card, the one in her maiden name, the one she had maintained since before the marriage, that lived in a separate wallet she kept in the inner pocket of her coat. She had never given Winston a reason to know about this card. She had never given him a reason to ask. She had simply kept it. The way you keep certain things without entirely knowing why. The way survival sometimes works quietly, instinctively, long before the emergency arrives. The room was on the 14th floor. She rode the elevator up alone. The doors opened. A long corridor. She found her room. She put the key card against the door and the lock clicked open and she went inside. The room was clean and warm and impersonal in the particular way of good hotel rooms. She stood in the middle of it for a moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed. She did not take off her coat. She did not take off her shoes. She just sat. The phone lit up again. She did not look at it. She ordered room service, soup and toast, because that was what her body asked for, even though her mind had nothing to say about food at all. She ordered it and put the phone back down and sat looking at the city through the window. 14th floor. She could see the lake from here, a long dark shape at the edge of the lit grid of the city. She had been looking at this city from above for 6 years. From the penthouse in River North, 42 floors up. A view so striking that every guest who came to the apartment went straight to the window and said something about it. She had stopped seeing the view years ago. You do that with things you live with every day. You stop seeing them. The room service arrived in 20 minutes. She ate 2 bites of toast. She looked at the soup. She put the toast down. Her phone had now shown 15 missed calls and 12 messages. She knew this without looking directly at it. She could feel it, somehow the way you can feel a room that is slightly too crowded, even when you are not looking at the people. She looked at it long enough to see that the most recent text was from a number she did not recognize. She put it face down again. There was a bath running. She had turned it on when she came in, some automatic impulse toward comfort, toward warmth, toward the private enclosed space of hot water. But she had not gotten in it. She went to the bathroom now and turned it off. The water was still, perfectly still. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at herself in the mirror above the sink, the composed face, the steady eyes. The face she had learned to wear the way you learn to wear a uniform automatically, without thinking about it, until the uniform becomes the only version of yourself you can imagine. Under it, something she had been calling anxiety for 2 years. Something she had been calling hormones since the pregnancy. Something she had been calling exhaustion and overcommitment and the reasonable stress of building a life. She looked at it now, straight on. For the first time, she named it. She had known, not about Delia specifically, but she had known that something was wrong. She had known it the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive. A specific pressure change in the atmosphere of your own life. She had registered it and she had filed it and she had continued getting dressed and attending galas and signing foundation documents and making coffee for 2 people every single morning. I knew, she said to the mirror. Not a question. Not a revelation. A verdict. She sat down on the bathroom floor. The tile was cold through the fabric of her gown. She put her back against the cabinet under the sink. She put both hands on her stomach. The baby moved, slow and deliberate, like someone turning over in sleep. I know, Maggie said, to the baby, to the room. I know. She sat there for a long time. The city was out there. Winston was out there. Somewhere. Probably in a car now. Probably looking at his phone. Probably working through the phrasing of whatever came next. He was good at phrasing. He had always been good at controlling the language around a situation. She had admired this about him once. The precision of him. She had mistaken precision for honesty. She had made a number of mistakes. She sat on the bathroom floor and she let herself understand this without flinching. She had known something was wrong and she had not looked. Not because she was stupid. Not because she was weak. Because looking required a change she was not ready to make, and she had kept that readiness at a careful distance for long enough that she had started to believe it was wisdom rather than fear. It had been fear. She was done being afraid. She was not sure yet what that meant, practically speaking. She did not know what happened next. She did not know what she was going to say or do, or where she was going to sleep after tonight. She did not know what her life looked like from this point forward. But she was done being afraid of finding out. She put her hand against the cold tile floor. She pushed herself up. Slowly, the way you do when you are 7 months pregnant and sitting on a floor is not something you do lightly. She stood. She looked at herself in the mirror again. Same face. Different understanding of what it was looking at. She went back to the room. She sat on the bed. She picked up her phone. She locked it, unlocked it, locked it, unlocked it. She put it on the nightstand. She did not call anyone. Not yet. She was not ready yet for the particular intimacy of saying this out loud to another person, of making it a story that existed in the world outside her own head. It existed in her head and in this room and in the quiet of a hotel on Michigan Avenue. And for right now, that was the exact right amount of existence for it to have. A knock at the door. She looked at the door. Then she looked at her phone. A text she had missed. From Nora, I'm at the gala. I came with Jim Ketterman's wife. I saw what happened. I'm in the lobby of your hotel. I've been here for 20 minutes. Can I come up? Maggie stared at the message. She typed back, how did you know I was here? The response came in under 10 seconds. Because I know you. You wouldn't go home. And this is the hotel you always loved before you were his wife. Before you were his wife. She read that sentence twice. Then she typed, room 1407. She put the phone down. Phone down. She looked at the door. She waited. Nora knocked again in 4 minutes. Maggie opened the door. Nora Whitfield was 39 years old and still in the dress she had worn to the gala, dark red, slightly formal, very much not her usual style. She had a tote bag over one shoulder. A tote bag. She had apparently brought a tote bag to a black tie event. She took one look at Maggie. She did not say anything for a moment. She did not make a sound. She just stood in the doorway and looked at her with the specific expression of a woman who has been holding something in for a long time and is waiting for permission to put it down. Okay, Nora said finally. First the shoes. Then you eat something. Maggie looked at her. You knew. Nora came inside. She set her tote bag on the chair. She sat across from Maggie on the other bed and looked at her steadily. I suspected, she said. I told myself I was wrong. You weren't wrong. I know. A long silence, the city outside. The distant sound of traffic. How long? Maggie asked. Nora looked at her hands for a second. I think about a year. Maybe longer. She looked up. I'm sorry, Maggie. I kept telling myself you would tell me when you were ready. I should have said something. I should have just said something. What would you have said? Nora took a breath. I don't know, she said honestly. But something. Maggie nodded. This was one of the things she had always trusted about Nora. She did not pretend to have answers she did not have. In 6 years of navigating a world full of people who always had answers, Nora's willingness to say I don't know had been a kind of oxygen. Nora reached into the tote bag. She pulled out in order a change of clothes for Maggie, a protein bar, 3 bottles of water, an unopened box of crackers. Maggie looked at the contents laid out on the bed between them. You brought all of this, she said, to the gala. I brought all of this tonight, Nora said, because I saw his face at the podium. And I know his face, and I knew where you would be. Maggie picked up the crackers. She opened the box. She ate one. She tasted nothing. She ate a second one. She reached into the tote bag and pulled out the last item. A folded piece of paper. She looked at it for a moment, then unfolded it. A printed bio page, a photograph, a name, Theodore Gaines, divorce attorney, former federal prosecutor. A single line of description that said he does not dramatize, he wins. She looked at Nora. I printed it before I came, Nora said quietly. I didn't know if you'd need it, but I thought I should bring it. Maggie looked at the page. She looked at the photograph. A man in his early 50s with silver hair and a calm, direct gaze. She looked at the name. She folded the paper carefully. She set it on the nightstand beside her phone. Okay, she said. That was all she said. Just okay. But it contained, inside it, everything that came next. Nora stayed until 2 in the morning. They talked. About the gala at first, then about nothing related to it at all. About a terrible movie Nora had watched on her laptop the week before. About the pigeons on the windowsill of Nora's apartment building that had begun what Nora described as an aggressive real estate campaign. About the soup Maggie had not eaten, which Nora ate half of while insisting she was not hungry. They talked the way women talk when one of them is in crisis, and the other one loves her not fixing it, not resolving it, just being in the same room with it, making the room feel smaller and warmer and more survivable. The baby kicked at 11:45 with what Maggie chose to interpret as commentary. Opinionated, Nora said, watching Maggie's hand move to her side. Always, Maggie said. She did not know yet that she was telling the truth. At midnight, she knew her phone had received more messages. She did not count them. She did not look at them. She set the phone on the nightstand face down, and she left it there. Nora made tea from the room's complimentary kettle. The tea bags were the paper kind that come in little silver envelopes, the kind that produce tea that tastes like the memory of someone else's tea rather than tea itself. They drank it anyway. Sitting cross-legged on the 2 hotel beds in their event dresses, heels off, Nora's red and Maggie's navy, like the aftermath of something that had not yet decided what it was. He told people, Maggie said at one point. Not dramatically, just as a statement of fact. He told at least some of those people in advance. That's why the room went quiet the way it did. They weren't surprised. They were just waiting to see how I would handle it. Nora was quiet for a second. Yes, she said. I think so too. He orchestrated it. She was still working through the shape of this, the way you work through the shape of something large by describing its edges. He stood at that podium, and he orchestrated the moment. He thought about it. He planned it. He did. Why? She asked. And then immediately, no. I know why. He wanted me to leave quietly. He wanted to create a public situation that he would privately offer to resolve if I agreed to certain terms. It was a pressure move. Nora looked at her. You sound like a lawyer, Nora said. I was a lawyer, Maggie said. Before that word. The way it just sat there between them. Nora left at 2:14. She hugged Maggie at the door in the particular way Nora hugged people she was worried about completely, with both arms, with a slight rocking motion that was entirely unconscious and entirely true. She pulled back and looked at her. Call me at any hour, she said. I mean any hour. 3 in the morning is fine. 4 is fine. I mean it. I know you mean it. And eat the rest of those crackers. Good night, Nora. After the door closed, Maggie stood in the room alone. She changed. She put on the clothes Nora had brought, soft pants, a worn shirt she recognized as her own, something Nora had apparently retrieved from Maggie's gym bag at some point, a detail she chose not to examine too closely because it made her want to cry and she was still not ready to cry. She folded the evening gown. Carefully, with the same attention she gave to folding things when she was trying to impose order on a situation that would not hold still. She folded it and placed it on the chair and smoothed it with both hands. She stood at the window. Chicago at 2:30 in the morning was still doing its Chicago things. A taxi pulling away from the curb below. A couple on the far corner, the kind of couple who is either very happy or very unhappy. It was impossible to tell from 14 floors up. A delivery truck with its hazards blinking, a patient orange rhythm in the dark. She put both hands on her stomach. She began. Not out loud. Internally, in the specific ordered way she used to prepare for depositions. What she knew, what she suspected, what she needed to find out, what she had. She had more than she realized when she started listing it. She had 6 years of observations carefully not examined that were now available to be examined. She had a prenuptial agreement, a copy of which lived on her personal drive under a label that said house insurance documents, because even at 29 years old and in love, some part of her had understood that she should keep a copy and that she should keep it somewhere he would not think to look. She had a charitable foundation directorship that she had always treated as meaningful work, and that she was now, in the cold and specific light of 2:30 in the morning, beginning to re-examine from a different angle. She had a law degree from Northwestern that she had not used professionally in 6 years but that had not gone anywhere. Knowledge does not go anywhere. It waits. She had Nora. She had the folded piece of paper on the nightstand. She had this room. She had, and this was the one that required the most careful handling herself. Whatever version of herself was currently available. The version who had walked out of a rooftop ballroom without running. The version who had checked into a hotel under her maiden name by reflex. The version who was standing at a window at 2:30 in the morning and making an inventory instead of falling apart. That version. She had her. The bathwater had long since gone cold. She could smell it faintly from the bathroom, the particular clean smell of hotel bath products, eucalyptus or something designed to suggest eucalyptus. She did not go to the bath. She stood at the window until her back began to ache, which did not take long because she was 7 months pregnant and standing for long periods was no longer a thing her body tolerated without commentary. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, it was not deep. It was the kind of sleep that exists on the surface of waking, that keeps you near the edge of consciousness while giving you just enough rest to continue. She dreamed about the kitchen in the penthouse. Not a nightmare. Just the kitchen. The particular light in it in the morning. The marble counters. The coffee maker she had learned to use in the first month of their marriage. She dreamed she was standing at the counter making coffee, and she could smell it, the specific smell of good dark coffee in the morning, and she made 2 cups without thinking about it, set the second one aside, and then stood there for a moment looking at it. In the dream, she knew was not coming to drink it. She had always known in the dream. She woke up at 6:47. She lay still for a moment. The ceiling of the hotel room. White. Plain. Not the ceiling of the penthouse, with its architectural details, its intentional grandeur, its way of reminding you even while sleeping of where you were and with whom. This was a plain white ceiling. She looked at it and felt something she had not felt in the penthouse in a very long time, like herself. She picked up the phone. She looked at it. 43 missed calls and messages at last count. She put it back down. She looked at the nightstand, the folded bio page of Theodore Gaines. She picked that up instead. She read it again, the photograph, the name, the description. He does not dramatize, he wins. She set it down. Okay, she said to the room. She got up and she went to the window and she looked at Chicago in the early February morning. And she let herself understand, fully and without any remaining protective distance, that her life had just divided itself into before and after. She had lived in the before for 37 years. The after had started last night in an elevator, watching herself in a mirrored wall. She was not sure yet what the after looked like. She was not sure what it contained. She was not sure what she was going to have to give up or give over, or fight for or fight through. But she was standing at a window in the early morning looking at a city, and she was in some imperfect and incomplete and entirely real way ready. Then the phone rang, unknown number. She almost did not answer it. Then she did. Margaret. Patricia Hargrove. Not Maggie. Never Maggie. The full name delivered with the precision of a woman who considers nicknames a failure of self-respect. Patricia. I want you to know, Patricia said in the voice she used when she was about to say the opposite of what she meant, that what occurred last evening was not something I was aware of in advance. Maggie waited. I think, Patricia continued, that there are ways to handle this with discretion. That would be better for everyone involved. For everyone, Maggie repeated. The Hargrove name carries significant weight in this city. A public conflict would damage Patricia. Maggie's voice was very calm. She noticed this herself. She had not planned for her voice to be calm. It simply was.
Are you calling me to ask me not to make trouble?
A pause. I am calling to extend a hand. You are calling, Maggie said, because you are afraid of what I know and what I might do with it. A longer pause. I don't know what you mean by that. I think you do. She let that sit. I'll be in touch. She hung up. She looked at the phone in her hand. Patricia Hargrove had risen at 5:30 or 6 in the morning and made this call. In the years of Maggie's marriage, Patricia had never called before 9. She ate breakfast at 8, read the paper, and did not take calls until she had finished both. Today, she had called at 6:53. She was afraid, not of losing a daughter-in-law, not of the damage to Maggie. She was afraid of exposure. She was afraid of what a woman with a law degree and nothing left to lose might choose to do with 6 years of careful observation. And she should be. Maggie put the phone down. She went to the desk and she sat down and she opened the notepad. The hotel provided the small white one with the hotel's name at the top. She picked up the pen. At the top of the first page, she wrote 3 words. What I have, then she began to list. She was still writing when the knock came at the door at 9:15. She opened it. Room service she had not ordered. She started to say so, and then she saw the cart soup again, different from last night, something with vegetables and broth and toast, and a small pot of tea, and a fruit plate, and a note in handwriting she recognized. The kitchen sends its regards. Nora, I called ahead. She brought the cart inside. She sat at the desk and she ate the soup while she kept writing. All of it, every detail, every financial structure she remembered, every document she had signed, every timeline she could reconstruct. The notepad was full when she was done. She looked at what she had written. Then she picked up Theodore Gaines's bio page from the nightstand. Okay, she said again, to herself, to the room, to whatever was next. She reached for her phone. Breathing room scene after the first major shock, she stood at the window for a long time after the call to Theo's office. She had been put on hold and then spoken to a very efficient assistant who had agreed to pass on her message and her credentials. Now she stood at the window and watched the lake. The February light on the water, the color of it. Something between gray and silver and the particular blue of cold. The color did not have a simple name. It had never needed one. It was just itself. A pigeon landed on the windowsill outside, looked at her with one eye. Left, her back ached. She put one hand on the small of her back the way she had been doing for weeks and pressed in slightly, and that helped. A little she breathed. She could smell the soup from the desk, broth and vegetables, and something faintly like thyme. Her mother used to put thyme in soup. She had learned this from her mother, who had learned it from her mother. A chain of soup and thyme that went back further than she could trace, and that existed entirely independently of Winston Hargrove and always had. The baby moved. She put both hands on her stomach and stood at the window, looking at the lake, and let herself breathe in and out in the particular rhythm of someone who has made a decision and is letting the weight of it settle before she picks it up and carries it forward. She stood there for a long time. The lake did not change. The cold outside did not change. The room behind her held its quiet. She stood and breathed and felt the baby move and did not think about anything in particular. Just that, just this, just the window and the lake and the particular color of February, light on cold water. She had not slept. Not really. Not in the way that counted. At 3 in the morning, the hotel was quiet in the particular way of places that contain many lives but keep them separate. She could hear, very faintly, a television from the room next to hers. A laugh track. Some comedy program playing for someone who also could not sleep. She understood why you would put on a comedy at 3 in the morning. The laugh track at least provided the impression that somewhere, for someone, things were funny. She thought about turning on the television herself. She decided against it. Instead, she opened her laptop. She was a former corporate attorney. She had practiced for 4 years before she married Winston, specializing in mergers and acquisitions. She had sat across tables from people who built financial structures the way other people built mazes, with the specific intention that the person navigating them would get lost. She had been good at finding her way through. Then she had gotten married. She had told herself it was a choice. She had said to herself and to others that she wanted to be fully present in her marriage, that she wanted to be available, that she did not want to be the kind of couple where both people had demanding careers and no one had a life. She had believed this, almost entirely. She had believed it the way you believe a story that is mostly true. Most of it was true. She had wanted those things. She had also been made gently and persistently, and over a long period of time, to feel that continuing to practice law would be a source of friction, an inconvenience, a sign of misplaced priorities. She had not identified this at the time. She was identifying it now. She opened the prenuptial agreement. She kept a copy on her personal drive, not in the shared drive that she and Winston both accessed. Her own drive, her own copy. She had requested it at the time of signing. Winston's attorneys had looked briefly surprised, which she had registered and moved past, and she had kept it in a folder labeled House Insurance Documents because she did not want to explain the folder if anyone ever asked. No one had ever asked. She read the agreement, all 47 pages. She read it the way she used to read contracts when she was practicing word by word, structure by structure, looking for the places where language did something other than what it appeared to do. She got to page 31 at 4:15 in the morning. Paragraph 8.3. The language regarding marital assets. The standard clause excluding premarital assets from division in the event of divorce. She had read this at 29 and understood it and accepted it. She had not read the subsection. She read the subsection now. It was 12 lines. It concerned what constituted a voluntary contribution to the marital estate. It defined certain conditions under which premarital assets could be reclassified. It was not standard language. It was very specific, very carefully drafted language that referenced the transfer of funds through entities in which the other party held a named directorship. She read it again. For the past 4 years, she had been the named director of the Hargrove Capital Charitable Foundation. Winston had presented this to her as a gift, as recognition of her interests. as an acknowledgement of the work she had been doing behind the scenes at the galas and the board events and the investor dinners, helping him build relationships and maintain them. He had said, "This is the official version of what you already do. This is the title you deserve." She had been proud of it. Genuinely. She had attended quarterly meetings and approved grant applications and been photographed at foundation events and felt, for the first time since leaving her law career, that she was doing something that mattered in its own right. She had signed documents, many documents, quarterly authorizations, transfer approvals, standard foundation paperwork that she had reviewed carefully because she was a careful person, but that she had reviewed as foundation documents, not as potential reclassification instruments. The foundation's endowment was $14 million. She sat in the hotel room at 4:15 in the morning and looked at the screen and looked at paragraph 8.3 and understood what she was looking at. He had built a door into his own prenuptial agreement, a door that only opened from one direction, a door that, if you knew where it was, could convert $14 million in premarital assets into marital assets that would be subject to equitable distribution. The question was whether he had known, whether he had built it on purpose, or whether it was a structure his attorneys had created and he had simply benefited from without examining the implications. Either possibility told her something she needed to know. She saved the document to her personal drive. Then she saved it to an external drive. Then she emailed it to herself at an email address she had maintained since law school, an address that existed independently of any account Winston could access. 3 copies, 3 locations. She closed the laptop. "He made a mistake," she said. She said it to the empty hotel room at 4:17 in the morning. She did not say it triumphantly. She said it the way you state a fact you are still in the process of verifying. She said it quietly and carefully, and with the specific precision of someone who has learned not to overcommit to any conclusion until the evidence is complete. But it was real. It was real, and it was hers, and she had found it at 3 in the morning reading a document he had assumed she would never read closely enough. She picked up her phone. She typed a text to Nora, "You were right, about all of it." She put the phone down. Then she opened a new document on her laptop and she started writing. Not notes this time, a timeline, dates, events, observations. Everything she could reconstruct from memory about the last 2 years, and then the 2 years before that, and then the 6 years entire. She wrote for 2 hours. She was still writing when the sky outside began to change. Chicago February dawn. Not the dramatic kind. The gray kind. The kind that arrives like an acknowledgement rather than a celebration. She watched it come through the hotel window while she kept typing, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was different from thinking about nothing. Thinking about nothing is emptiness. Thinking about nothing in particular while your hands are moving and your mind is working is focus. It is a specific kind of productive quiet. The dawn came fully. She saved her document. She made herself stop. She put the laptop on the desk. She lay down on the bed without changing out of what she was wearing. She pulled the covers up. She closed her eyes. The past came while she lay there, not in the ordered way of the timeline she had been building, in the other way, the involuntary way, the way memory arrives when you have stopped managing it. The first apartment they looked at together, before the engagement. He had walked through it with the confident stride of someone who was accustomed to assessing spaces for their utility. He had pointed to the smallest bedroom, the one with the northern light, and said office. She had said nursery. He had smiled at her. A warm smile. She had kept it for days. She had not thought about that exchange until this moment. The specific quality of that smile warm, genuinely warm, but containing inside its warmth a decision that had already been made, a decision she was smiling her way into accepting without knowing she was accepting it. The business trip to Singapore. 11 days. He had called twice. The second call at the end had been brief. She had tried to extend it, asking about the meetings, about the city, about whether he had eaten. He had said he was tired. She had said, of course. She had let him go. She had stood in the kitchen of the penthouse afterward, looking at the phone in her hand and registering something she had quickly covered over with the explanation of time zones. The 12-week scan. The ultrasound room. The technician asking if Dad was excited. Winston saying, of course, with the smile he used at events, the one calibrated for the room, rather than for the person he was looking at. She had noticed this at the time. She had thought he has a lot on his mind. She had thought he just needs time to adjust. She had thought, stop looking for problems. She had been very good at telling herself to stop looking. The text message in October. She had seen it over his shoulder while he was in the kitchen and she was walking past. Not the whole message. Enough. 3 words of it. Words that, in context, in that specific order, with that specific name at the top of the screen, had told her everything. She had kept walking. She had gone to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and thought, "You are 7 weeks pregnant. You are hormonal and anxious and overreading things. You are imagining implications that are not there. You do not know what that message means. You do not know the full context." She had known the full context. She had chosen to put it down, to set it aside, to carry it in a very small locked box in a very quiet part of her mind where she did not have to look at it every day. She had carried it for 5 months. "I carried it," she said to the ceiling of the hotel room. She lay still. Outside, the city was fully awake now. She could hear the faint composite sound of it, traffic and voices, and the ordinary machinery of a February morning in a major city. People going to work. People getting coffee. People doing the 10,000 things that constitute a life continued forward without interruption. She had been one of those people last week. She was something else now. She was not sure yet exactly what, but she was paying attention to it, and that felt like the beginning of knowing. She called her brother at 5 in the morning. Reed Calloway picked up on the second ring. He did not sound like she had woken him. He sounded like he had been awake for a while. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. The particular silence between people who have known each other their entire lives and know that a call at 5 in the morning means something real. "Where are you?" he asked. She gave him the hotel's name and address. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm not hurt." "Baby's fine." "That's not what I asked." She looked at the ceiling. "No," she said. "Not really." Okay, she could hear him already moving. The sound of keys, a coat zipper. He was not asking any more questions. He did not need more information to know what to do with it. "I'll be there by 2. "Reed, it's a 9-hour drive, I know." More sounds of movement. "Don't go anywhere." "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said. "But stay anyway." He hung up. She looked at the phone. She had a brother who would drive 9 hours at 5 in the morning without asking why, and she had spent 6 years attending a life that had slowly replaced everything that felt like this. She could see that now. The replacement had been gradual and total, and she had participated in it. She was not the victim of it alone. She had made choices that had made it possible. She had also been in a gilded cage. And both things were true. She put the phone down. She picked up the hotel notepad. She opened it to the page that said, "What I have." She read through the list, then she added to it. One more line at the bottom. "My brother, my mother, Nora. The law I still know." She closed the notepad. She looked at the window. The February morning, gray and cold and real. She was not okay. She was not fine. She was a woman in a hotel room at 5 in the morning at 7 months pregnant, whose husband had just publicly redirected the future of his empire to another woman's child while she stood 10 feet away. She was also a former corporate attorney who had just found paragraph 8.3. She was also a woman whose brother was currently putting on a coat. She was also someone who had just named, for the first time, the thing she had been carrying for 2 years. And the act of naming it had not killed her. It had not even made her fall apart. It had made her, if anything, a little more solid, a little more present in her own life than she had been last night when she was standing at a gala bar, holding a glass of sparkling water, smiling at people whose names she knew. "Okay," she said, for the 3rd time, but this time it meant something different. This time it was not just a direction or a commitment. It was something closer to the beginning of a plan. At 9 in the morning, she called Theodore Gaines. His assistant answered. She explained that Mr. Gaines was fully booked through Thursday and that she could offer an appointment at "Please tell him," Maggie said, "that Margaret Calloway Hargrove is calling about a matter involving Hargrove Capital Group, a prenuptial agreement with potential asset misclassification under Illinois marital property law, and an immediate need for a protective filing." She was put on hold. The hold music was classical, something she could not immediately identify, something with strings. She was on hold for 45 seconds. Theodore Gaines came on the line. "Miss Calloway Hargrove," he said, "my 11 o'clock just moved. Can you be here at 10:30? "Yes," she said. She hung up. She looked at the clock. She had an hour. She went to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. The same face, the tired version of it now, with the particular texture of a face that has not slept, but clear-eyed, focused. She turned on the shower, hot water. She stood under it until the heat reached everywhere. The particular ache in her lower back loosened slightly. The baby shifted. She put her hand against the tile wall and breathed steam and let the water do what water does. Then she got out. She dried off. She got dressed in the clothes from Nora's bag, not ideal for a law office, but real. Hers, the kind of clothes that belonged to the person she actually was. She picked up her bag. She put in her laptop. She put in the hotel notepad. She put in the copy of the prenuptial agreement she had printed from the hotel's business center at 6 in the morning. She put on her coat. She opened the hotel room door. She stepped out. She had been making 2 cups of coffee every morning for a year and a half. She understood this now in the elevator on the way to the lobby with complete clarity. Every morning in the penthouse kitchen, the good Italian roast, ground fresh, the machine that cost more than her first car. She would make 2 cups. She would set one on the counter by the window, where he had always taken his breakfast when he was there. He had stopped eating breakfast at home 14 months ago. He had said early meetings. He had said, don't wait for me. He had said it once and she had adjusted, and she had gone on making 2 cups anyway. Out of habit, out of the momentum of the life they had built. Out of, if she was honest, the small daily act of insisting that the life still held the shape it once had. Every morning, 2 cups. The second one going cold on the counter. And she had poured it down the drain and told herself she had simply forgotten. She had done this every morning for 14 months. And every morning she had told herself she had simply forgotten. I wasn't forgetting, she said to the inside of the elevator. No one else was in the elevator. She stepped out into the lobby. She walked across the marble floor. She went out into the February cold. She turned toward the loop. She kept walking. Theodore Gaines's office was on the 32nd floor of a building that had been built in the 1980s and refurbished twice since, most recently with the kind of architectural restraint that signaled serious money without performing it. His waiting room had 3 chairs and a view of the lake. No diplomas on the wall. She would learn later that he found wall diplomas performative. She liked him for this, preemptively, before she had even sat down. He shook her hand when she came in. Firm. Without the excess pressure some men use when they want you to register their confidence. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and she sat, and he sat, and he picked up his pen and his small notebook, and then he simply looked at her and waited. This was, she would realize later, his first gift to her. He did not begin speaking. He did not fill the silence. He waited, with the particular patience of someone who has sat across from a great number of people in crisis and understands that crisis has its own timing. She told him everything. She told it in order without dramatizing it. The way she used to prepare witnesses: begin with what you know. Move to what you can demonstrate. Be clear about what remains uncertain. She told him about the gala. She told him about Patricia's call. She told him about the prenuptial agreement and paragraph 8.3 and the charitable foundation directorship and the $14 million in transfers authorized under her signature over 4 years. She pulled out the printed copy of the prenuptial agreement and set it on the desk between them. He did not reach for it immediately. He finished the notes he was making. He set down his pen. Then he picked up the agreement and read. Not skimming reading, page by page, paragraph by paragraph. She could see his eyes moving and she could not read what he was thinking, which she found both frustrating and reassuring. A man who revealed nothing at a negotiating table was exactly what she needed. He reached page 31. He read paragraph 8.3. He read it again. He set down the papers. The foundation transfers, he said. Yes, she said. He paused. You have documentation of those? All of it. 4 years of quarterly meeting records, grant approvals, wire transfers with my authorization signature. I have them on my personal drive. He looked at her. That is significant, he said. Then, that is potentially very significant, he explained. Under Illinois law, the character of assets, premarital or marital, depended partly on how they were handled during the marriage. If funds had been moved through an entity in which the non-owning spouse held a named directorship and exercised decision-making authority, a court might view the character of those assets as changed, commingled. The prenuptial agreement's exclusion clause, if the assets had effectively been moved into a structure subject to her direction, might not protect them. $14 million. He set up a situation, Theo said carefully, where he either miscalculated the legal implications, or he paused and looked at her directly. Someone decided this was an acceptable risk. Because he didn't expect me to read it closely, she said. Because he didn't expect you to read it closely, he confirmed. You were a corporate attorney. I was, she said. Before. He looked at her for a moment. You still are, he said. You simply stopped practicing. She felt something shift slightly in the room, not in the facts of the situation. In something smaller and harder to name. The acknowledgement of a thing that had been taken from her, or that she had given away, or both, because both could be true simultaneously. There is something else I need to ask you, Theo said. He set down his pen. This was a deliberate gesture, a signal that what came next was the kind of question that required complete attention without the mediation of note-taking. Your prenuptial agreement. The attorney who represented you at signing. Did you have genuinely independent legal counsel? She thought about Gerald Whitmore, 62 years old, an estate planning attorney who had handled her parents' affairs for 20 years. who had been introduced to the Hargrove family through a real estate transaction. She had known this vaguely, and who had reviewed the prenuptial agreement with her over the course of 2 meetings and told her it was standard. Standard for this kind of arrangement, he had said. She looked at Theo. My family's attorney reviewed it, she said. He was referred to the Hargrove family through a real estate deal a couple of years before the wedding. I knew that at the time, but I didn't think. Was that relationship disclosed to you, formally, as a potential conflict of interest, before he agreed to represent you in the prenuptial negotiation? She thought about this very carefully. The 2 meetings with Gerald Whitmore, his office in Evanston, the way he had held the agreement and flipped through it with the practiced speed of someone who had read many agreements and found them largely interchangeable, his use of the word standard, his reassurance that she was protected. No, she said, it was not disclosed as a potential conflict. Theo nodded. He picked up his pen again. He wrote something. He wrote it twice. Independent legal representation, he said, is a foundational requirement for prenuptial enforceability in Illinois. If the attorney who represented you had an undisclosed prior relationship with the other party or with entities connected to the other party, he paused. The agreement's enforceability becomes contested. She looked at him. A court would need to determine whether you received genuinely independent advice, he said, whether the representation was adequate, whether you entered into the agreement with a full and unbiased understanding of its implications. Another pause. If the answer is no, the entire agreement may not be enforceable. Not enforceable. The whole thing. 47 pages, the exclusion of premarital assets, the limitation of her claim in the event of divorce. The clause that had been designed, she now understood, fully and without protection to leave her with the minimum, in a situation where she would not know to challenge it, not enforceable. She sat with this for a moment. It was a large piece of information. It required time to become properly real. Make your calls, she said. Find out what Gerald Whitmore's relationship to the Hargrove family actually was. She paused. I want the full picture. I'll have something for you by this afternoon, Theo said. She stood. He stood. They shook hands again. She picked up her copy of the prenuptial agreement, tucked it under her arm, and walked to the door. Miss Calloway Hargrove, he said. She turned. He does not know yet, Theo said, that you have seen paragraph 8.3. No, she said, he doesn't. Good, Theo said. Keep it that way. Reed arrived at 1:46. She was at the desk in the hotel room when she heard the knock. She opened the door, and there he was, 6'2", still in the same jacket he had owned for the last 6 years, the brown canvas one with the collar that sat slightly crooked because he had caught it on a nail in his workshop once and it had never quite recovered. He was carrying a paper bag from a gas station. His hair was doing what it always did, which was whatever it felt like. She looked at him. He looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. He just looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been calculating all the way down 9 hours of interstate exactly what he is going to find when he gets to where he is going, and who has found it, and who is taking it in. Hi, she said. Hi, he said. He came in. He set the paper bag on the desk. She looked inside it, an assortment of gas station snacks, a water bottle, a bag of pretzels, some kind of granola bar that looked aggressively optimistic. I didn't know what you'd want, he said. This is fine, she said. This is good. Thank you. He sat in the chair by the window. She sat on the bed. She told him everything, the way she had told Theo in order, without dramatizing, beginning with what she knew. He sat and he listened. She could see him taking it in, each piece of it, building the picture the way he built things carefully, with attention to structure, not rushing to the finish before the foundation was solid. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. So he set it up, Reed said, before the wedding. He arranged it so that the person who was supposed to be protecting your interests was actually connected to him. Yes. While you were 29 and planning a wedding and in love. Yes. And then he spent 4 years having you sign documents that may have changed the legal character of his own assets. Potentially. Theo's verifying. Reed looked at the window. He did that thing he did when he was thinking, a slight tightening of the jaw, the look of a man doing math. Then he looked back at her. He thought Reed said that because you gave up your legal career to be his wife, you'd stop being a lawyer. Yes. He miscalculated. He did. Reed nodded. One slow, deliberate nod. Then he reached into the gas station bag and held out the granola bar. Eat that. You're 7 months pregnant and you've been awake for 36 hours. She took the granola bar. She ate it. It tasted like oats and optimism and her brother driving 9 hours without being asked. It was one of the better things she had eaten in years. Later that afternoon, while Reed was in the bathroom and she was alone at the desk, she pulled out the hotel notepad and started a new list. Not the legal one. A different one. Every decision she had deferred. Every opinion she had pre-screened through the question of whether he would find it inconvenient. Every interest she had quietly set aside. Her law career. That was the first line. Her friendship with Nora, which Winston had called very sweet in a tone that meant he found it slightly beneath the level of sophistication he expected their social life to reflect. The dinners she had stopped scheduling, because the evenings when he came home and she was going out had started to carry a particular quality of atmosphere that made her choose, more and more often, to stay. The apartment in Lincoln Park she had wanted to look at before the wedding, the one with the courtyard and the third-floor windows. She had seen it in a listing, shown it to him, and he had chosen River North instead. And she had nodded and said, "You're right, the location makes more sense." And she had believed at the time that she was agreeing rather than conceding. The book she had been reading when she met him that she had never finished. She could not remember now what it was about. She remembered putting it on the nightstand and not going back to it. She filled 2 pages. She kept writing. She was not performing her grief on paper. She was not listing these things for effect. She was listing them because they were real, and because looking at them directly, all of them, in a list with no softening or excuse, was the only way to fully understand the architecture of what had happened to her. Not what he had done to her, what she had participated in. What they had built together, each making their contribution to a structure that had slowly closed around her like a room with doors she had stopped noticing were locked. She had noticed now. She set down the pen. She folded the list. She put it in her coat pocket, not to keep, not to refer to later, just to carry it with her for a while, the weight of it, the specific heft of 2 pages of deferred desires, until she was ready to put it down. She would know when she was ready. At 4 in the afternoon, her phone rang. "Nora." "I found something," Nora said without preamble. "I've been looking into him. Don't judge me for that." "I'm not judging you for that." "Charlotte Reeves," Nora said. "Do you remember her?" "From your wedding." "A woman in a blue suit, dark hair. She worked with Winston in business school," Maggie thought. "Vaguely." "Charlotte something. We barely spoke. I found her. She's a financial analyst in New York now. She had a profile post, an old one, dated about a year before you met him. I found it while I was looking through connections." A pause. "It was about him. She didn't name him directly, but the timeline, the details, it's him." "What did she say?" Another pause. This one was Nora choosing words. "She said he was the kind of man who makes you feel chosen, until you realize you were just selected for a specific purpose." The room was quiet. "The kind of man who makes you feel chosen, until you realize you were just selected." She sat with that sentence. "There was a warning," she said. "There was a woman who tried to leave a warning," Nora said. "A year before you met him. On a platform you weren't looking at. A woman Maggie had briefly met at her own wedding. A woman in a blue suit who had seemed slightly formal and slightly careful, and who Maggie had shaken hands with and moved on from within 5 minutes. A woman who knew." "Okay," Maggie said. She meant, "I hear this. I am putting it in the right place. I am not going to let it become a rabbit hole. I am going to note it and move forward." She had been doing that more and more. Noting things and moving forward. She was beginning to understand, actually, a very good coping mechanism when deployed in service of action rather than avoidance. "Thank you," she said. "Are you eating?" Nora asked. Reed brought gas station granola bars. "That's not what I asked." "Yes," she said. "I'm eating." "Good," Nora said. "I'll be by tomorrow." She hung up. She looked at the window. A woman at her own wedding had left a warning she never found. A man who makes you feel chosen until you realize you were selected for a purpose. She thought about what her purpose had been. The wife who attended events and knew names and signed documents and was present in all the ways that did not cost him anything and were useful in all the ways that served him. She had been selected for a very specific purpose. She had fulfilled it very well. She was done fulfilling it. The next morning, she went back to Theo's office. He had called her the previous evening with an update. His voice had been careful. She had learned to read his careful voice the way she had once learned to read opposing counsel's careful voice as a signal that what came next was significant. Gerald Whitmore had been disbarred 18 months ago. The disciplinary proceedings were a matter of record. Conflict of interest. An undisclosed professional relationship with a financial client. The client was listed under a subsidiary entity. The subsidiary entity, when traced, connected to Hargrove Capital Group. She had listened to this without speaking. He wasn't just referred by the Hargroves, she had said. No, Theo had confirmed. Based on what I'm finding, he had an existing professional relationship with a Hargrove entity at the time he agreed to represent you in the prenuptial negotiation. He was their attorney, representing himself to me as mine. That is the most accurate characterization. She had held the phone and looked at the lake. "That's fraud," she had said. "That is a very serious problem," Theo had replied. That is a potentially invalidating problem for the entire prenuptial agreement. Now she sat across from him in the morning light, and they went through it piece by piece, the disbarment record, the entity structure, the timeline that placed Gerald Whitmore in a paid relationship with a Hargrove subsidiary at the exact time he was being held out to Maggie as her independent legal representative. He told me it was standard, she said. He told me the agreement was standard for this kind of arrangement. Standard for this kind of arrangement, Theo repeated, meaning standard for an arrangement where the purpose is to limit your claims in the event of divorce, using an attorney whose loyalty was never to you. She heard this land. She let it land completely. She did not feel sorry for 29-year-old Maggie, who had sat in Gerald Whitmore's Evanston office and signed a 47-page document based on his assurance that it was standard. She did not feel sorry for her in a way that was useful. What she felt was something cleaner and harder and more directional than sorrow. She was angry. Not the hot, formless kind of anger that made people do things they regretted. The cold, precise kind. The kind that organized her rather than destabilizing her. The kind she recognized from the last 2 depositions she had given before she left the law. Depositions in which she had sat across from witnesses who were lying to her very carefully and had felt exactly this quality of focused, useful fury at the carefully spoken dishonesty in front of her. I want to challenge the agreement, she said. We will challenge the agreement, Theo said. We will also be looking at the foundation transfers under the asset commingling theory, and we will be requesting discovery on every entity, every LLC, every subsidiary, every trust structure connected to Hargrove Capital Group. He'll fight it. He'll fight it, Theo agreed. He has resources and he has attorneys who are very good at making things expensive and slow. What he does not have, he paused and looked at her directly, is an agreement that will hold up to the scrutiny it is about to receive. And he does not have our certainty about that versus the uncertainty he currently operates under. He doesn't know what I have, she said. He doesn't know what you have, Theo confirmed. Let's keep it that way for as long as possible. She nodded. She thought about Winston, somewhere in the city, with his attorneys, running their own calculations, making their own assumptions about what Maggie knew and what she was capable of and what she was willing to do, making she was quite certain, the same fundamental error he had been making for 6 years. What's next, she asked. We file the initial proceedings, he said, and I make a call to the Illinois State Bar about Gerald Whitmore. I want to make that call myself, she said. He looked at her. I'm a licensed attorney in Illinois, she said. Inactive, not disbarred. I have standing to file an ethics complaint. He smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that appeared and disappeared quickly, leaving only a slight adjustment in the quality of his expression. Then I'll get you the form, he said. She left his office at noon and walked into the February cold. Reed was waiting outside. He had driven the morning, looking at the lake, apparently, he said, because there was a lake and he didn't have one at home, and he had wanted to look at it. This was entirely believable because Reed was the kind of person who drove 9 hours to look at a lake without finding this unusual. They walked. She told him what Theo had told her. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer opinions or solutions until she had finished. Then he said, so it goes to court. Eventually. Maybe. Theo thinks the discovery requests alone will create enough pressure that Winston's team will want to settle rather than go through a full proceeding. He doesn't want those foundation transfers examined in open court because it's bad for him. Because it's bad for him. Reed put his hands in his coat pockets and walked beside her without speaking for half a block. Then, how long does this take? Months, she said. He told me not to expect anything final for at least a year, possibly longer. These things move slowly, and he'd rather I understand that up front than be surprised by it. Reed nodded. What do you need in the meantime? She thought about this. A place to live, she said. Not the penthouse, not anywhere connected to him. Okay, Reed said. We'll find you a place. I want the Lincoln Park apartment, she said. It surprised her slightly, saying this. She had not consciously decided it, but she had been thinking about it since the night before. The listing she had shown Winston years ago. The courtyard. The third-floor windows. There was an apartment I wanted to look at before the wedding. I never got to see it in person. I want to look at something in that neighborhood. Lincoln Park, Reed said. Got it. He pulled out his phone. She looked at him. You're going to look right now, she said. You need a place to live, he said. I'll look now. She watched her brother scroll through rental listings on his phone while walking on a Chicago sidewalk in February, and she felt, with an intensity that surprised her, something close to joy. Not the performed kind. Not the kind that existed at galas and events. The specific, uncomplicated joy of someone who has just remembered that there are people in the world who love her practically, who show up in canvas jackets with gas station granola bars, who look at lake listings without being asked and start searching for apartments before she has finished explaining what she wants. There, Reed said, showing her the screen. Lincoln Park, 3rd floor, corner unit. Available end of month. She looked at the listing. A courtyard. 3rd floor windows. The light in the photograph, morning light coming in sideways through windows that faced east. Call them, she said. Breathing room scene after the financial revelation. They walked back to the hotel along the lake path. The lake in February was extraordinary in its way. The color of it, that specific gray-blue of cold water under winter sky. The sound of it, small waves against the breakwater. A sound that was almost rhythmic but not quite. Almost musical but not quite. Something just to the left of pattern. She walked slowly. Reed adjusted his pace without comment. They did not talk. The cold pressed against her face and her hands, and she pulled her coat more tightly around her, and they walked, and the lake kept doing what it had always done, which was exist with absolute indifference to the concerns of the people walking past it. She found this enormously comforting. The lake was not watching. The lake did not have an opinion. The lake was just itself, cold and large and endlessly present. She looked at the water, she breathed in. Cold air, slightly mineral, slightly of the lake itself. She breathed out. The baby moved. A long, slow movement, like someone stretching. She stopped walking for a moment, put her hand on her side where the movement was. Reed stopped too, a half step ahead, and looked back, and saw what she was doing, and waited. The movement came again. She breathed. Reed started walking again after a moment. She fell in beside him. They went on, the cold on her face, the lake smell, the sound of the small waves, her breath in the cold air, her brother's footsteps beside her. This was enough. Right now, this was exactly enough. She got a call from Carla Voss at 2 in the afternoon. Carla was a woman she had been friends with for 4 years, a board member's wife, someone she had met at the first gala after she became a Hargrove. They had served on the same charitable board. They had lunched together monthly. Maggie had considered her a friend. She read the message twice. 3 sentences. The first expressed concern. The second suggested that these situations can be so damaging to everyone involved. The third asked whether Maggie had considered the value of discretion, for the child's sake. The child's sake, Maggie's child. Being used as a reason for her silence. She put the phone face down on the desk. She did not respond. She thought about Carla, about their lunches, about the easy warmth of them, the conversation, the way she had felt over those 4 years, that she had found something real in the carefully manicured garden of her social life. A genuine connection. She thought about the fact that Carla had not called to ask how she was, had not called to ask if she needed anything, had not called to offer to come over or bring food or sit with her or any of the things real friends did when someone's life fractured. She had called to suggest discretion. She was protecting Winston's interests. She was the 5th person in 2 days to protect Winston's interests. His mother, his attorney, his press contacts, an old acquaintance. And now Carla. She was, it turned out, very effectively surrounded by people who were in his world. She had built her social life inside his world. She had let his world become her world. She had found inside it people she had mistaken for hers. The lesson arrived without drama. She took it. She opened the hotel notepad to a clean page. She wrote at the top, actually mine. She wrote 3 names, Nora, Reed, Caroline. She looked at the list for a moment. Then she put the pen down. Then she picked it up again. She wrote a 4th name, Theo Gaines. Then in parentheses, professional, but real. She closed the notepad. 4 people. She had built 6 years of life inside Winston Hargrove's world and found at the end of it 4 people who were actually hers. That was enough. That was more than enough. 4 real things were worth considerably more than 200 careful ones. She picked up her phone. She texted Nora, "Can you come by tomorrow morning? I want to talk through some things." Then she called her mother. Caroline Calloway answered on the second ring. "Tell me where you are," Caroline said. Not hello, not how are you. Just tell me where you are. "Chicago," Maggie said. "Hotel on Michigan Avenue?" She gave the address.
I'm coming, Caroline said. Mom, you don't have to.
"I know I don't have to," Caroline said. "I'm coming anyway." A pause. "I should have come 6 years ago. I should have looked harder. I should have said more." "Mom, I'm not doing this to be dramatic," Caroline said. "I'm doing it because you're my daughter, and you're 7 months pregnant, and you're in a hotel room in February, and I have a car, and I know how to drive it." A pause. 7 hours, Maggie said. 7.5. "I drive slower than your brother." "I know you do." "I'll be there tomorrow morning," Caroline said. "Don't do anything I wouldn't do until I get there." "What wouldn't you do?" "Nothing," Caroline said. "I just always wanted to say that." And then more quietly, "I love you." "I love you too," Maggie said. Delia Price called on the 3rd day. Maggie almost didn't answer. Reed's phone, unknown number. Reed was standing at the window with a coffee, and he looked at the screen. And then he looked at Maggie with the expression of someone who is about to hand over something that requires handling. And he said, "Someone asking for you. Says her name is Delia Price." Maggie looked at the phone in Reed's hand. She looked at the window, then back at the phone. She held out her hand. Reed gave her the phone. "Miss Price," she said, "Mrs. Hargrove." Delia's voice was even. Careful. The voice of a woman who had been rehearsing this call for a while and was still not entirely sure it was the right one to make. "I want to say first, I understand if you don't want to speak to me. I wouldn't if I were you." Maggie waited. "I also want to say that I was told things about your marriage that I now have reason to believe were not accurate." "What were you told?" A pause. "That you had separated. Privately. That you and he were together in name only because of the pregnancy. That you had..." Another pause. "That you had agreed to this arrangement. Both of you. Together." Maggie closed her eyes. "He told you we were separated," she said. "Yes, he told you this was a mutual arrangement." "Yes, while I was 7 months pregnant and living in our shared apartment and attending every public event as his wife." "Yes," Delia said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "I know exactly how that sounds." "I'm not judging you," Maggie said. She meant it. She was still in the process of learning how much she meant it, but she meant it. She had been standing for 3 days on the edge of hating Delia Price, and she had kept stepping back from that edge, not from virtue, but from accuracy. She was a woman who was good at accurate assessments. The accurate assessment of Delia Price was, this was a woman who had been given a different story by the same man who had given Maggie 6 years of carefully managed story. He had needed them separate. He had needed them not to talk. He had underestimated them both. "He lied to both of us," Maggie said, with different scripts, but the same intent. Delia was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, I think that's right." A pause. "I need to tell you something," Delia said, "about the foundation." Maggie's attention sharpened. She moved to the desk. She sat down. She picked up the hotel notepad and a pen. "Tell me," she said. "I work in investor relations," Delia said. "I see fund flows. I am good at my job, and one of the things I am good at is noticing when numbers don't behave the way they should." She paused. "About 6 months ago, I noticed unusual transfer patterns between the charitable foundation and 2 secondary entities, LLCs, that I couldn't identify in our public filings. I raised it with James Ketterman, the CFO," Maggie said. "Yes, he told me it was under internal review. He asked me not to flag it externally." His tone suggested, she paused, choosing the word carefully, that flagging it externally would not go well for me. "Did you flag it externally?" "No," Delia said. "But I documented it." A beat. "I have documentation of everything I noticed, dates, amounts, entity names, transfer patterns. I've had it in my personal files for 6 months. Maggie was writing. "Why? Because I'm a lawyer by training," Delia said. "I didn't practice after law school, but I never stopped thinking like one. And because something felt wrong to me, and when something feels wrong, I write it down." Another pause. "And because I was beginning to suspect that the situation I was in was not what I had been told it was. I wanted to have something. In case." The same instinct that had made Maggie keep a copy of the prenuptial agreement in a folder labeled house insurance documents. The same self-preserving reflex. 2 women on opposite sides of the same deception, both quietly writing things down. "Send it to me," Maggie said. "Everything you have. Send it to my personal email." She gave Delia the address. "I'll send it tonight," Delia said. A pause. "Mrs. Hargrove." Delia said. "Maggie," she said. "You can call me Maggie." Another pause. "Maggie." She seemed to be deciding whether to say the next thing. Then she said it. "I'm sorry. I know that may mean nothing to you. But I am. I believe you," Maggie said. She did. The other woman, her complexity in full. After the call ended, Reed and Nora had arrived that morning. As promised, were both looking at her. "She's not the villain," Maggie said. She said it to both of them and to herself simultaneously. "No," Nora said. "He needed one. So he built one. He told me a story about being happy and told her a story about being trapped and made sure we would never compare notes." She paused. "He never thought we'd talk. He made us into adversaries so that even if one of us found out, the instinct would be to fight the other woman instead of looking at him." Reed nodded slowly. "Classic," he said, not admiringly, with the tone of someone identifying a technique. "He's been doing it for years," Maggie said. "Charlotte Reeves. Probably others before her, a man who makes you feel chosen. Until. She put the pen down. She looked at the notes she had just made. Delia's documentation, the LLCs, the transfer patterns Ketterman had told her to ignore. James Ketterman, the CF. The man who had signed the formation documents for the secondary entities and had told Delia not to flag them externally. A man who had been with Winston for 9 years and who had just been given reason, in the form of a woman with documentation and a law degree, to start thinking about what his name on those papers would look like in discovery. She wrote his name in the notepad. Then she wrote Audrey Moss, Hargrove Capital's general counsel, the woman who had drafted the prenuptial agreement, the woman who had known about Gerald Whitmore's conflict and had Maggie was increasingly certain raised it with Winston and been overruled. She wrote a circle around both names. People who knew. People who were now in various ways exposed. People who had reasons of their own to think carefully about where their loyalties were best placed. She looked at the circle. She thought, he built an empire on the assumption that everyone around him would always make the same calculation. That loyalty to Winston Hargrove was the safest bet. What he had not accounted for was the specific moment when the calculation changed. That moment was now. She went to the bathroom. She looked in the mirror. She looked at herself for a long moment. Somewhere along the way, she said, I became invisible. Not because I disappeared, because I allowed it. She paused. I am done allowing it. She ran cold water over her hands. She dried them. She went back to the desk. That afternoon, the news piece went up. It was in a Chicago business publication, small, targeted, read primarily by people in finance and real estate, and the specific overlapping social world those industries created. The piece was brief, an anonymous source. The Hargrove situation, characterizing the dispute as complicated by a wife who had taken a confrontational stance despite significant financial exposure. A confrontational stance. She read the piece, she read it again. Then she called Theo. He's running narrative, Theo said when she read him the piece. His voice was calm. She appreciated his particular brand of calm, which was not the dismissive kind that meant he wasn't taking it seriously, but the considered kind that meant he had already thought through the implications. He's trying to establish public perception. He wants you characterized as the aggressor before the legal proceedings begin in earnest, which means he's concerned, she said. Which means he is very concerned, Theo confirmed. A man who is confident in his legal position does not manage the press narrative. He lets the legal process speak for him. He is not confident. A pause. This is actually useful for us. How so? Because every communication he makes through channels other than his attorneys, every anonymous source, every press contact creates a record, and every record potentially becomes discoverable. She thought about this. He made another mistake, she said. A consistent pattern, Theo said dryly. She hung up, she looked at the piece again, confrontational stance. The language of a man who had expected her to be confused and frightened and deferential, and who was now adjusting his narrative to account for the fact that she was none of those things. She thought about the 6 years of galas and foundation documents and deferred decisions, and the second cup of coffee going cold on the counter of a penthouse kitchen. She thought about the word confrontational. I was never confrontational, she said to the room. I was just finally paying attention. Validation whisper 4 and second engagement moment. Reed left that evening to find a short-term rental for himself. He was not leaving the city. He had made this clear without being asked about it. He had simply said, at some point during the afternoon, I'll find somewhere nearby for a few weeks, as though this were a thing that required no discussion. She did not argue with him. When he was gone, she sat alone at the desk. The day's papers were spread in front of her. The legal notes, the list, the news piece. Delia's documentation, which had arrived by email at 6 o'clock, as promised 18 pages of carefully organized financial records, dates and amounts and entity names laid out with the precision of a woman who thought like a lawyer even when she was not practicing as one. 2 women, both of them keeping records, both of them writing things down in the dark. She put her hands flat on the desk. I thought love meant sacrifice, she said. Not a revelation, a reckoning, not erasure. She sat with that. She had sacrificed things for the marriage. That was normal. That was what you did. You gave up certain freedoms and certain possibilities in exchange for the specific possibilities of a shared life. And that exchange, when it was real, was worth it. But she had not just sacrificed. She had been erased. Gradually. By degrees so small she had not seen each one happening. A career, an opinion, a friendship, an apartment, an interest, a preference, a word she used to use for herself that had slowly stopped seeming to fit, and then stopped seeming to matter, and then stopped being used at all. She had not been reduced. She had allowed herself to be reduced. Both were true. She could protect the life she had built, the penthouse, the status, the name, the world she knew. She could take whatever settlement Winston's attorneys offered and agree to their terms and walk away from this with enough to be comfortable and never have to look at another financial document or speak to another attorney or face the specific public discomfort of being the woman whose husband had made that announcement at that gala. Or she could build a life worth protecting. She knew which one she was going to choose. She had known since 4:15 in the morning when she read paragraph 8.3 and said to the empty hotel room, he made a mistake. She just needed to sit with the fullness of it for a moment. The weight of the choice, the cost of it. The particular kind of courage required not to take the easier thing when the easier thing was available and your feet hurt and you were 7 months pregnant and you were very tired. She was tired. She was also done. She woke at 3 in the morning, not from a nightmare, not from the baby, from the particular dark of a mind that had been running at full capacity for 4 days and had not found its floor yet. She lay in the hotel room in the dark. She looked at the ceiling. She listened to the hotel's quiet, the particular contained quiet of a building that held many sleeping people. She had not let herself feel it yet. Not fully. She had been busy and purposeful, and she had been building her case and making her lists and talking to attorneys and finding paragraph 8.3, and she had been in all of these ways very productively occupied. But the dark at 3 in the morning was not productive. The dark at 3 in the morning simply was. She lay in it. She let herself feel what she had not yet let herself feel. Not anger, that had come and gone. Not grief for the marriage as she had believed it to be. That had come and gone too, in the hotel bathroom, on the cold tile floor, the first night. What arrived now was different, deeper, the underneath of everything else. She did not know who she was outside of being Winston Hargrove's wife. She had known who she was before. Maggie Calloway, who had graduated from Northwestern Law, who had argued motions and prepared witnesses and sat across deposition tables from difficult people and held her ground, who had an apartment in Lakeview that she shared with Nora for 1 year, the best year of her 20s, the year she was entirely herself, who had opinions about things and expressed them, who laughed loudly and stayed out late and had a best friend who was a nurse and an older brother who built things with his hands and a mother who put time in soup. She had had all of that. And then she had fallen in love with a man who had made her feel for a while that she was choosing to become someone larger, that becoming Winston's wife was an addition to herself, not a substitution. She had believed this. She had wanted it to be true with a need that had made her selective about what she looked at. Now she lay in the dark and tried to find Maggie Calloway underneath Maggie Calloway Hargrove, and she found her, but she was like a room that has been closed off and aired out and had all its furniture removed. She was still there. The structure was still there. But she was empty in a way that would require actual filling. She did not know how to fill herself back up. She did not know what she liked anymore that was actually hers, and not just a residue of his preferences. She did not know what she wanted her days to look like. She did not know who she would be in the apartment in Lincoln Park, alone in the morning, making coffee for one person. She did not know what that felt like. I disappeared, she said to the ceiling. Her voice was very quiet. I did it gradually, and I called it love. She put both hands on her stomach. The baby moved. Slowly, a long, contemplative movement, as though the small person inside her was also, in their own way, thinking. She felt tears come and she let them. She had been deferring them for 4 days. She let them come now, in the dark quietly, without performance. She cried, and it was not dramatic and it was not the end of anything. It was just grief, the specific real grief of a woman who has understood what she has lost. Not the marriage, not the man, but the years, the good years, and the false ones both, the versions of herself she had set aside, the choices that had been made so gradually they had not felt like choices. She cried for a while. Then she stopped. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the ceiling. She's there, she said. To herself. To the baby. To the room. I'm still there. I know I'm still there. She lay in the dark. She breathed. In and out, in and out. The baby moved again. The small rhythmic pressure of someone who was becoming. We'll be okay, she said. Not a promise she could fully back up yet. Not a statement of certainty about a future she could not see. Just the thing you say to the person you love most when you do not know yet what comes next, but you know you are not going to stop. She called her mother at 4:15. Caroline picked up on the first ring. Tell me where you are, Caroline said. She had been saying this. She would keep saying it. It was the thing she said when she meant I am here. I am oriented toward you. You are not alone. Same hotel, Maggie said. Same room. I'm fine. I just needed to hear your voice. All right, Caroline said. And then she said nothing. She just breathed. That was the thing about Caroline that no one outside the family fully understood. She was quiet when quiet was what was needed. She did not fill silences because she was uncomfortable. She stayed inside them. Maggie stayed in the silence too. Outside, Chicago was doing its 4 in the morning things. She could hear it faintly, the distant machinery of a city that never stopped entirely. I don't know who I am outside of him, Maggie said finally. I know, Caroline said. That scares me more than any of the legal stuff. I know that too. A pause. When your father died, Caroline said carefully, I didn't know who I was outside of being his wife either. We had been married for 31 years, you understand? She paused. It took me 2 years to find myself again. And I want to tell you something important, Maggie. She was still there. The whole time. I just had to remove the things that had grown over her. Maggie lay in the dark and felt her eyes sting again. How? Small things, mostly, Caroline said. I made soup, the kind your grandmother made. Not because your father liked it, he never cared much for it actually. Because I liked it. That was the first thing. The soup. A pause. You figure out the small things first. The big things follow. Maggie thought about this. About soup and small things. About a 64-year-old woman who had spent 2 years finding herself in her kitchen after 31 years of marriage. Mom, she said. Yes. Come tomorrow. Come in the morning. I'm already in the car, Caroline said. Maggie frowned. It's 4:15 in the morning. I couldn't sleep either, Caroline said. I've been in the car for an hour. I pulled over when you called. You've been driving. I'm fine. I'll stop somewhere and get breakfast when the diner's open. A pause. I'll be there by 9. Maggie closed her eyes. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Caroline said. I'm your mother. I'm 7 hours and a bad cup of highway coffee away. This is not a sacrifice. This is just where I'm supposed to be. Breathing room scene, the deepest moment. She hung up. She lay in the hotel room. She did not sleep and she did not lie awake. She existed in that middle state that is not quite either, the body resting, the mind very slowly releasing the grip it had maintained for 4 days. She listened to the hotel, the faint sound of the heating system, the particular silence of the 14th floor at 4 in the morning. She could smell the hotel's soap, something clean and slightly antiseptic and oddly comforting. She could feel the weight of the blanket. She could feel the baby, who had settled now, who was still and quiet the way they went still and quiet sometimes, the way that always made her hold her breath slightly until the next movement came. It came. She breathed out. The window was a rectangle of dark gray city light. She watched it without looking for anything in it. The light just was. The room just was. She just was. She stayed there, she breathed, she let the dark hold her without fighting it. At some point she slept. When she woke, the room was pale with morning. Her phone showed 7:42. She lay still for a moment. She looked at the ceiling. She felt different. Not fixed, not resolved. Not the specific lightness of a problem solved. Something quieter and more fundamental than that. The specific quality of a person who has hit the floor and found that the floor held. Who has reached the bottom of the dark and discovered that the bottom was real and had a surface and that she was still there, sitting on it, present and breathing and intact. She pushed herself up. She went to the window. The lake. February. The specific color of it. Okay, she said. Caroline arrived at 9:12. She did not call from the lobby. She called from the door. Maggie opened it, and there was her mother, 64 years old. Gray hair she did not dye because she found dyeing hair tedious. Her good winter coat that was 7 years old and showed it, a bag over one shoulder, and in her other hand a thermal container. She looked at Maggie. She put the bag down. She wrapped both arms around her. She held on. She did not say anything. She did not cry. She held on and she rocked slightly and she held on. Then she stepped back. She looked at Maggie the way she had always looked at her, the full assessment, the accounting, the particular quality of attention that meant someone who had known her since before she could speak was taking a complete inventory. You look terrible, Caroline said. Good morning, Mom. Have you been sleeping? Some? Eating? Reed brought gas station food. That's not what I asked. She held up the thermal container. I made soup. The time kind. She looked past Maggie into the room. Where's the kitchen? It's a hotel room. There isn't one. Then find me something to heat this in. She walked in. She put her bag on the chair. She found the room's small microwave. She began organizing herself around it with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been solving practical problems in unfamiliar kitchens her entire adult life and was not going to be stopped by the limitations of a hotel room. Maggie sat on the bed and watched her. Reed arrived 20 minutes later. He had a bag of real groceries, not gas station. Actual groceries that he set on the desk with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has solved the correct problem. Caroline looked at the groceries. She nodded at Reed. He nodded back. They did not need to say anything. Nora came by at noon. The 4 of them filled the hotel room. It should have felt crowded. It felt instead like the right density of people for the specific weight of what was being carried. Caroline ate 2 bites of a protein bar and then gave the rest to Reed. Reed argued with Caroline about whether the soup needed more salt and lost. Nora and Maggie sat on one of the beds and Nora said something about her pigeons, and Maggie laughed, really laughed. Not the performed kind for the first time in 5 days. At some point in the afternoon, Caroline washed the soup container in the bathroom sink, while Reed stood on the small balcony on his phone, and Nora read something on her phone, and Maggie looked at the room. She thought about the penthouse, the high ceilings, the view that made visitors stop at the window, the chef's kitchen she had barely used because Winston preferred the chef, and the chef preferred mornings when the kitchen was his. The rooms that had been designed to impress, decorated to communicate a specific and aspirational story about the kind of people who lived in them. She tried to remember a moment of ease in that apartment, a moment of being unrehearsed, a moment of feeling, not like Winston Hargrove's wife performing their shared life, but like herself in her own home, comfortable. She could not find many. She had loved the idea of the apartment. She had loved what it was supposed to signify, what it had actually felt like daily in the body, in the lived experience of her own skin. That was something she had not been honest about for a long time. "I've been homesick," she said. Nora looked up. "For this," Maggie said. She gestured at the room, at the four of them, at the thermal soup container being washed in a hotel bathroom by a 64-year-old woman who drove through the night to be here. "I moved into a palace, and I have been homesick for this for years." Nora did not respond immediately. She just looked at her. With the quality of recognition that was one of the things Maggie loved most about her, the specific look of someone who sees exactly what you mean. "I know," Nora said. Later that afternoon, Caroline fell asleep in the chair. She had been awake since 3 in the morning and driven 7 hours and made soup and organized a hotel room and won an argument about salt with Reed, and she was 64 years old, and these things take their toll. She fell asleep sitting up with a book she had been pretending to read, her head tilting slowly sideways until it rested against the chair back. Reed was on the balcony again. Nora had gone to get coffee. Maggie was alone, with her sleeping mother in a hotel room on the 14th floor. She looked at her. Caroline Calloway at 64. The lines in her face that hadn't been there 20 years ago. The hands that had made soup and folded laundry and graded papers and done the specific labor of a woman's life with the quiet competence of someone who never needed to perform her own capability because she was too busy actually doing the work. Maggie had learned to fold laundry from those hands. She had learned to put time in soup. She had learned by example and not by instruction what it looked like to be in your own life, fully to take up exactly the space that was yours and fill it completely without apology and without excess. She had set that knowledge aside for 6 years. She was going to need it now. She pulled out the hotel notepad. She wrote one sentence: "The woman I was before him is still here. I know where she is." She closed the notepad. That evening, after everyone had gone and the room was quiet, she opened her laptop to find Delia's email with the documentation attached. She downloaded it. She read through it. 18 pages. Precise. Methodical. Everything Delia had noticed and recorded over 6 months. She sat back. "His money was never mine," she said quietly. "It never was. And that's okay." She paused. "I never needed it to be." She looked at the room, this modest, impersonal, entirely adequate hotel room. She had been living in it for 5 days, and she had been more herself in it than she had been in a penthouse for 6 years. She saved Delia's documentation to her drive. She wrote Theo's name in the notepad. She wrote the word tomorrow. Then she turned off the laptop and she looked at the window, and she thought about the Lincoln Park apartment and the courtyard and the morning light coming through third-floor windows, and she thought, "That is mine. That will be mine. I am going to live in that apartment and make coffee for one person every morning and go to bed when I want to go to bed and be exactly as loud or as quiet as I actually am." She was so ready for that. She was ready. She organized the desk. This was not necessary. The desk was not disordered. But she organized it anyway: the laptop, the notepad, the copy of the prenuptial agreement, Delia's printed documentation, Theo's card. She lined them up with the desk's edge. Square. Even. She smoothed the surface with the palm of her hand. She did it again. She stood at the desk with both hands flat on the surface, and she breathed, slowly, and she looked at the organized row of things that constituted her legal life: the evidence, the contact, the strategy, the next steps. She was always done this. When she was overwhelmed, she organized the nearest available surface. In law school, it had been her desk. In the apartment in Lakeview, the kitchen counter. In the years of her marriage, she had reorganized the pantry 3 times and the linen closet twice and the bathroom cabinet so many times that she had stopped keeping track. Winston had never noticed. He was not someone who noticed how the linen closet was organized. She had been grateful for this. She had understood even then that it was a coping mechanism. She had not wanted to examine it too closely. She examined it now. She was a person who organized surfaces when she was overwhelmed. This was not a flaw. This was information about herself. She was also a person who kept copies of important documents in folders with misleading names, who remembered things precisely. who read agreements word by word, who found paragraph 8.3 at 3 in the morning after a major trauma while 7 months pregnant. These were not the habits of someone who had disappeared. These were the habits of someone who had been very quiet, very persistently, keeping herself alive. She moved into the Lincoln Park apartment on the last day of February. Reed found it. Reed negotiated the lease because she was managing too many other things, and he said, "Let me handle this one with the specific quiet authority of an older brother who knows exactly when to step in." The apartment was on the 3rd floor, corner unit, morning light from the east. A small courtyard below that was covered in February snow, but that she could already see from the photographs would be something different in spring. She signed the lease under Callaway. Just Callaway. Reed built the crib. He had driven back to Pennsylvania one weekend and come back with his tools, and he had assembled the crib in the 2nd bedroom in 2 hours, while Maggie sat on the floor nearby and watched and talked to him about nothing in particular, about the town where they grew up, about a neighbor they'd had as children whose dog had had a complicated relationship with their mailbox, about the summer they had both been on the same construction crew for 3 weeks, and she had been terrible at it, and he had been kind about how terrible she was. Nora helped with the rest of the 2nd bedroom. They spent a Saturday afternoon at a furniture store that Nora described as not fancy but good, and that had in fact a very good selection of things that were solid and real and not designed to impress anyone. They bought a changing table, a small dresser, a lamp, a mobile with small wooden birds. The living room was sparse. She did not care. The desk by the window was enough. The couch that Reed had found on a marketplace application. The rug she had not yet chosen. She would choose the rug when she was ready. She made coffee every morning for one person, at the temperature she preferred, in the amount that was actually appropriate for one person. She did not make a second cup. She did not pour the second cup down the drain. She simply made one cup and drank it, and it was, in the specific, uncomplicated way of small things done correctly, exactly right. Audrey Moss. Theo called on a Thursday morning in the 1st week of March. "Audrey Moss has been in contact," he said. Her personal counsel reached out yesterday. Maggie was at the desk in the Lincoln Park apartment. Morning coffee. 1st week in the new place. Still learning the quality of the morning light in these windows. She resigned from the firm, he said, last week. She has retained personal legal counsel separate from the Hargrove organization. Her attorney wants to arrange a meeting. What does she want to discuss? Her counsel was deliberately careful about specifics, Theo said. She said Ms. Moss has documentation relevant to your situation, and that her reasons for sharing it are, in her words, personal and professional. She knows about Gerald Whitmore, Maggie said. I believe Ms. Moss knows a great deal, Theo said. The question is what she wants to do with it. Set up the meeting, Maggie said. The meeting was at Theo's office on a gray Thursday morning. Audrey Moss arrived with her personal attorney, a woman named Grace who was younger than Audrey and had the particular quality of compactness that very efficient people sometimes develop, as though they have learned to take up exactly the space they need and no more. Audrey was 44. She looked like someone who had spent the last month not sleeping well and had made the professional decision to show up anyway. She was precise in her appearance without being performative about it. She sat across the conference table from Maggie and Theo, and she held a folder in front of her, and she did not begin speaking immediately. Maggie recognized this. She was organizing herself. She was deciding how to say what she needed to say. She waited. I drafted the prenuptial agreement in 2018, Audrey said. Her voice was even. Professional. At that time, I was aware that Gerald Whitmore, the attorney representing you, had a prior professional relationship with a Hargrove Capital subsidiary. I raised this with Winston. He told me it was not a legally significant conflict. He told me to proceed, she paused. I should have declined. I did not. That is something I carry. Maggie looked at her.
Why are you here now?
Audrey met her eyes, because what he did at the gala was not part of a legal strategy. It was cruelty, deliberate, public cruelty toward a woman who was 7 months pregnant and standing 10 feet away. She paused. I have watched Winston make strategic decisions for 11 years. That was not strategy. That was something else. Another pause. I have limits. She opened the folder. She placed one by one the following: a set of financial records showing transfer patterns between the charitable foundation and 2 secondary LLCs over a period of 18 months. Formation documents for those LLCs, signed by James Ketterman as authorized agent. And last, placed with deliberate care in the center of the table, a memo. I wrote this to Winston in January of this year, Audrey said. It was an internal legal opinion regarding the prenuptial agreement's enforceability risk if the foundation transfers were subjected to litigation discovery. She paused. He received it. He acknowledged it. He chose to proceed with the existing structure. Maggie reached across the table and picked up the memo. She read it. She read it twice. It was 12 paragraphs. It was very clearly written. It described in precise legal language exactly the risk that Maggie had found in paragraph 8.3, the possible reclassification of premarital assets as marital property through the foundation transfer structure. It concluded with a recommendation that the structure be modified to eliminate the risk. Winston had received this memo in January. He had made the announcement at the gala in February. He had known. He had known what the prenuptial agreement might not protect. He had known that the foundation structure carried legal risk. And he had proceeded, because he had calculated that she would not look, that she would not read, that she would not know. He knew, she said. She said it to Audrey directly. He knew, Audrey said. Maggie set the memo down. She looked at it on the table. She looked at it the way you look at a thing that has just confirmed what you suspected and simultaneously made it more real than suspicion had allowed it to be. Then she looked at Theo. "Is this discoverable?" she asked. "Every page of it," Theo said. He said it twice. Every page. In discovery. In full. She looked back at the memo. He had known. He had married her with a compromised prenuptial agreement. He had placed her as the director of a foundation whose transfer structure could reclassify his own assets. He had received a memo telling him this was a legal risk, and he had stood at a podium at a rooftop gala and pointed toward the future of his empire while she stood 10 feet away, 7 months pregnant. He had calculated that she would leave. Quietly. With the minimum. He had underestimated her in every possible way. Mirror moment 10 continued in Theo's restroom. She excused herself before the meeting ended. She went to the restroom. She stood at the sink. She looked at herself in the mirror. Different mirror than the hotel. Different mirror than the gala elevator. This one was good light, clean light, the kind that showed you clearly. She saw the attorney. She did not mean this metaphorically. She literally saw her, the woman who had graduated from Northwestern, who had known how to read contracts, who had found paragraph 8.3 at 3 in the morning and said he made a mistake to an empty hotel room. She had not lost that woman. She had put her in a drawer for 6 years. She was taking her out of the drawer now. She turned off the tap. She went back into the conference room. "I stayed quiet," she said back at the conference table. She said this as though she were continuing a sentence that had been occurring inside her rather than beginning a new one. "For years. I stayed quiet. I am done." Audrey Moss looked at her. "So am I," Audrey said. That evening in the Lincoln Park apartment, she went to the second bedroom. She stood in the doorway, the crib Reed had built, the changing table from the furniture store with Nora, the lamp. The mobile was small wooden birds that turned slowly when you moved them. The list on the wall, she had written it on paper and taped it to the white paint, next to the window of things still to add. A rug. Something for the walls. A rocking chair. The room was not finished. She was not finished. The legal proceedings were not finished. Her understanding of who she was as outside of the last 6 years was not finished. The Lincoln Park apartment was not finished. None of it was complete. But she was standing in the doorway of a room she had chosen, in an apartment she had signed with her own name, in a building where no one expected anything of her except to pay the rent. And the room was enough. It was entirely enough. The incompleteness of it was not failure, it was just where she currently was. Things that were in progress did not need to apologize for being in progress. She stood in the doorway for a long time. She thought about the child who would sleep in this room. The child who would look at these walls and this mobile and this particular morning light, and who would form their earliest understanding of what her home was from this room that her mother was building, incompletely and deliberately, one chosen thing at a time. "This is good," she said, to the room, to the crib, to the small person who was still becoming. "This is exactly good enough." Validation whisper 8. She went to the window in the second bedroom. She looked out at the courtyard below. Snow still, white and clean and quiet. "My daughter will not grow up watching her mother disappear," she said. "I will not do that. Not for him, not for anyone. She will grow up knowing her mother takes up her whole space." She put her hand on the window glass. Cold, real. She turned off the light. She went to bed. James Ketterman called on a Wednesday in the second week of March. Not Ketterman himself, his personal attorney. The call came to Theo's office. Theo called Maggie immediately. "He wants to talk," Theo said. "About what?" "The LLC formation documents. The ones with his signature. He's been advised by his own counsel that those documents are going to come up in discovery. He'd like to get ahead of that." "Get ahead of it how?" "By providing clarifying information about the purpose and structure of those entities," Theo said, "in exchange for a letter from our office confirming that our client is not pursuing claims against him personally." She thought about Ketterman. 50, 9 years with Winston. His signature on documents he may or may not have fully understood at the time of signing. A man who had carried things he should not have carried and was now looking at the landscape of that carrying. She did not feel sorry for him. She felt something more complicated. The particular quality of encounter you have with someone who made a moral error, not out of malice, but out of the specific cowardice of choosing not to ask questions you sense you do not want the answers to. She had made that error herself. She knew what it looked like from the inside. Draft the letter carefully, she said. He cooperates fully, or the letter has no value, make that clear. Already done, Theo said. The meeting with Ketterman's attorney produced, over 2 sessions, a detailed accounting of the formation and purpose of the 2 secondary LLCs. The entities had been established, per Ketterman's account, at Winston's direction. Their stated purpose had been investment management, specifically the management of a portion of the Foundation's endowment through vehicles that would provide better returns than the Foundation's existing portfolio. The actual structure, when examined against the Foundation's transfer records and the prenuptial agreement's asset definitions, told a different story. The movement of funds through those entities, over the 18-month period of their operation, had the effect, whether intentional or through negligence, and Theo was careful to keep that ambiguity in the record of positioning assets in a way that obscured their origin and character. Ambiguity works in our favor, Theo told her, because ambiguity in a high-value divorce proceeding requires disclosure. He cannot claim the structure was innocent without explaining it, and explaining it opens discovery on every aspect of it. She understood. She had understood it from the moment she read paragraph 8.3. The specific threat was not that the structure was provably fraudulent. The threat was that it was provably complicated. And complication in a divorce proceeding involving a man with a board of directors and institutional investors and limited partners who valued clean governance was its own form of weapon. Strategic Reclamation Layer 7 in full. She had been doing other things during these weeks. She had reconnected with a former litigation colleague, a woman named Patricia, who had gone from their firm to partnership at a boutique practice that did not intersect with Hargrove Capital. They had lunch. It lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Patricia said, "When you are ready to come back, call me first." Maggie had said, "I'm not sure I'm coming back to litigation." Patricia had said, "Then call me anyway and we'll figure out what you are coming back to." She had filed the ethics complaint with the Illinois State Bar regarding Gerald Whitmore. The complaint was 3 pages, precise, documented. It was not, Theo had told her, likely to produce any immediate outcome. Gerald Whitmore was already disbarred, but it created a record, a formal discoverable record of the specific manner in which her prenuptial representation had been compromised. She had also been in contact with Delia. Not frequently, a few texts, a brief call. Delia was navigating her own complicated situation. Winston's attorneys had initiated a conversation about the paternity of her son, which she had anticipated and had documentation to address, and which was, she said, infuriating but manageable. "He's trying to separate us again," Delia said in one of the calls. "He always tries the thing that worked last time," Maggie said. "Does he know we're in contact? He may suspect. He doesn't know the scope of it." "Good," Delia said. She had also been walking, every day, weather permitting, along the lake path near Lincoln Park, 8 months pregnant now. Her doctor recommended it, and her body required it, and it had become a practice 30 minutes in the morning, before anything else, before the legal calls and the email and the strategic calculations. She walked and she looked at the lake, and she did not think about anything specific. She thought about everything in the aggregate, without trying to organize it, and some mornings things became clear that had not been clear the night before. She trusted this process. She had learned, over the past weeks, to trust a number of things she had been systematically distrusting for years. Her own perceptions, her own judgment, the particular quality of knowing that arrived, in her body rather than her mind, when something was right or wrong. She trusted it. The business article. In the 3rd week of March, an article appeared. It was in a publication that covered private equity and institutional finance, not a tabloid, not a gossip column, not a general business publication, specifically private equity. Specifically the kind of publication read by the people who mattered to Hargrove Capital Group's operations. The article was careful. It was legally careful. It referenced an ongoing legal matter involving a challenge to a prenuptial agreement in connection with the Hargrove Capital Group. It mentioned questions regarding asset classification at the charitable foundation. It did not name Maggie directly. It referred to the current Mrs. Hargrove. It did not mention Delia. It referred obliquely to related family matters. It did not need to be salacious. The people who read this publication did not need salacious. They needed accurate. This organization has legal questions that have reached the level of public filings and press attention, and those questions are about how money moved through a charitable entity, and that is the kind of question that requires a conversation with your legal counsel before your next quarterly meeting. The phone, she learned later, started ringing at 7 in the morning. She read the article at her desk in Lincoln Park over her morning coffee. She read it twice. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific satisfaction of accuracy, of a situation being given its real shape by people who were not trying to protect anyone. He had stood at that podium and started a public story. She had not asked him to do that. She had not wanted public. She had walked out of the gala and checked into a hotel and spent a week in a hotel room trying to understand what had happened and what to do about it. The public nature of this was his authorship, not hers. She was not managing the ending of a story she had not begun. Midpoint wisdom fourth engagement moment, she read the line in the article again, the one about her confrontational stance. She thought about confrontational. She had spent 6 years being what they wanted her to be and doing what they needed her to do and signing what was put in front of her. She had made herself smaller in 100 small ways so that Winston could feel larger. She had deferred and accommodated and been reasonable and kept the peace and managed the room and made the right face at the right moment, and she had been good at all of it. She had been so good at making herself smaller that she had almost forgotten she could be the full size of herself. She picked up the pen. She wrote, in the hotel notepad she had brought from the hotel to the apartment because she had become attached to it. She had spent 6 years making herself smaller so he could feel larger. She was done shrinking. She looked at it. Then she put the pen down and picked up her coffee and finished it in the morning light from the east-facing windows of the Lincoln Park apartment. Mirror moment 12 and validation whisper 9. She set the cup down. She looked at the window. She did not need to be saved. She had been, without fully realizing it, waiting for something, for clarity, for permission, for some external validation that the course she was taking was the right one. She had been waiting for someone to come through the door with the answer. The person I was waiting for, she said to the morning light, was me. It was always going to be me. She was not waiting anymore. Patricia Hargrove called at the end of March. The second call. The one she had been expecting since the board meeting. Maggie knew about the board meeting from Theo, who had been kept informed through channels that operated in the ways these things operated in the interstices of institutional disclosure. The board of Hargrove Capital Group had met. It had been 3 hours. At the end of it, Winston had agreed to a period of voluntary operational leave while the legal matters were resolved. James Ketterman was serving as interim executive. She received this information without reaction, not because she did not feel anything, because the board meeting was a consequence, not a resolution. It was what happened when a structure that had been built on concealment was exposed to air. It was not justice. It was simply physics. Gravity operating on something that had always been going to fall. Patricia's call came 2 days after the board meeting. Margaret. Patricia. I want to ask you something directly, Patricia said. She had dropped the negotiating tone of the first call. She sounded, for the first time in 6 years, like someone who was not performing, like someone who was tired. Is there a way through this that does not destroy everything? Maggie considered the question. Define everything, she said. A pause. The company. His position. Patricia stopped. Both children, she said carefully, both of their futures. Maggie thought about this, about Eleanor, whom she was now 6 weeks from meeting, about Marcus, Delia's son, who existed in a complicated legal position through no fault of his own and who would be living with the consequences of his father's choices for the rest of his life. Both children deserve financial stability and clarity, Maggie said. Both of them. That is not negotiable. Whatever else gets negotiated, that part is not. Agreed, Patricia said quickly. The legal proceeding regarding the prenuptial agreement proceeds, Maggie said. That is also not negotiable. The agreement may not be enforceable, and that needs to be determined through the proper process. I'm not going to walk away from that. A long pause. And the company? I'm not interested in destroying the company, Maggie said. I'm interested in a fair accounting of what is mine. If a fair accounting leaves the company intact, then the company stays intact. I don't want to burn his life down. I want my own life. Those are the different goals. Patricia was quiet for a long time. You know, she said finally, you were always more capable than he acknowledged. Yes, Maggie said. I know. Another pause. I am sorry, Patricia said. For my part in this, I knew things I should have said. A breath. I should have said them years ago. Maggie thought about what it would mean to accept this. An apology from a woman who had always been kind to her in the specific way of someone who had categorized her as a useful acquisition rather than a person. A woman who had carried information about her son that she had chosen to keep, because keeping it protected what she valued more. "I hear you," Maggie said. "Not I forgive you. Not it's fine. Just I hear you." It was all she had to offer. It was, she thought, probably all she owed. The truth when arrives. By the end of March, everyone who mattered knew. Not through the business article alone. Through the aggregate pressure of accurate information, moving through the networks of people who cared about money and governance and institutional trust. Through the discovery filings. Through the prenuptial challenge, which was now a matter of public record. Through the conversations Theo had carefully and professionally conducted with the independent board members, providing information they had a right and a responsibility to have. 200 gala guests had seen what they had seen. A board of directors had met for 3 hours. A business publication had written what it had written. And the people who had been closest to Winston Hargrove, his CFO, his general counsel, his head of investor relations had each, in their own way and for their own reasons, made choices that placed them no longer squarely in his corner. She had not orchestrated this. She had simply told the truth. Precisely. Through the proper channels. With documentation. Truth, when it has documentation, does not need orchestration. Delia, again, the other woman's resolution. Delia's call came on a Thursday afternoon. "The paternity challenge has been resolved," Delia said. Her voice was calm. The specific calm of someone who has been braced for a fight and has found that she was well enough prepared for it. "Marcus is his son. It's documented. That part is closed." "Good," Maggie said, a pause. "I want to say something," Delia said, "about what this has been like. From where I've been standing." "You can say it." "I thought," she paused, choosing her words, "I thought I was the one who had really seen him, the real version. I thought all of you and the marriage and the public life were the performance, and what I had was the real thing." Another pause. "I was wrong. We were both performances, different ones, for different purposes. There wasn't a real thing underneath. Or if there was, it wasn't something either of us was actually given access to." Maggie sat with this. "He's very good," she said, "at making you feel like you have the real version." "Yes," Delia said. "He is." A pause. "I don't know what comes next for me," Delia said. "I'm figuring it out. But I wanted you to know I don't think of you as someone I was in competition with. I never should have been. I know that now. We were never actually competing," Maggie said. "He just needed us to think we were." A silence. "How are you feeling?" Delia asked. "The baby 6 weeks or so," Maggie said. "Maybe less." "You'll let me know," Delia said. It was not quite a question. "I mean, if you want to, you don't have to. But if you want to, I will," Maggie said. She meant it. She did not attend the board meeting. She was not a party to Hargrove Capital's governance. She had never been on the board. She had sat at its events and smiled and redirected conversations and helped Winston maintain relationships with the people who held seats at that table, but she had never held one herself. She did not need to. The work had been done in documents and filings and the careful professional disclosure of accurate information through appropriate channels. The board meeting was the consequence. She did not need to be in the room for consequences to land. She was in her apartment in Lincoln Park when the meeting happened. It was a Tuesday in early April. She had a cup of tea at the desk. The morning light came through the east windows. The courtyard below was still winter gray, but she could see, in the beds along the courtyard fence, the first approximate green of something beginning. She had not thought about the board meeting all morning. She had been thinking about the apartment, about what she wanted on the walls of the living room, about whether the lamp on the desk was the right lamp. It was adequate, but she was not sure it was right. She had been thinking about the rocking chair she had not yet bought for the second bedroom, and about the specific quality of morning light in that room, and about what kind of rug she wanted under the crib. These were not avoidance. These were her life, the real texture of it, the actual content of days. Theo called it 4 in the afternoon. The board voted to continue operations under interim executive leadership while the legal matters are resolved, he said. Winston has formally agreed to the terms of the operational leave. His attorneys reached out to ours this afternoon with a revised settlement position. She sat up. "What position?" "It's closer to fair," Theo said. "Not there yet, but they have moved." Significantly, a pause. "I believe the memo, the Audrey Moss memo, was discussed in some detail at the board meeting. The memo that showed he knew the prenuptial was risky. The one that showed he knew, Theo confirmed." She looked at the window, the courtyard, the green beginning at the fence line. "What do we do with the revised position?" she asked. "We respond," Theo said, "with our own counter. I have a number. Do you want to discuss it now or tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," she said. "I need to go for a walk first." "Then go for your walk," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." She put on her coat. She went downstairs. She walked to the lake. Breathing room 5 after the board, the lake in April. Still cold, but not the same cold as February. The cold with light in it now. The specific quality of early spring in Chicago when the city is still wearing winter, but something in the air has changed. Some signal has been given. Some internal rearrangement is underway. She walked the path. 8.5 months. Her pace was not fast. She did not require fast. She required movement. The specific physical act of putting one foot in front of the other on solid ground. A woman about her mother's age passed her going the other direction, walking a very small dog with an extremely dignified bearing. The woman looked at Maggie's stomach and smiled the small automatic smile of a woman who has been a woman in a body for a long time and recognizes the specific shape of that particular stage. Maggie smiled back. Two strangers on a lake path in April. Nothing connecting them except the knowledge that is not quite knowledge, but is something the shared experience of inhabiting a particular kind of life at a particular time. She kept walking. The lake was a different color today. Less winter silver. More blue. The specific blue of water warming slowly from the surface down. She walked and she breathed, and she did not think about the board meeting or the settlement position or the legal proceedings. She thought about the woman with the dog, about the green at the courtyard fence, about the rocking chair she was going to buy this weekend, a simple one, wood, something that would last, something Eleanor might sit in herself one day. She thought about Eleanor. She kept walking. The final confrontation, Winston's call. He called her on a Wednesday evening at 7. Not through his attorney, not through the family. His cell phone. Her phone showing his name in a way she had not seen it show his name since the night of the gala. She had been in the kitchen when it rang. She had been making dinner, actual dinner, with vegetables she had chopped herself, and a chicken she had seasoned with thyme because her mother had put thyme in everything, and she was her mother's daughter. She turned off the burner. She answered. "Maggie," he said. She did not respond immediately. She stood in her kitchen in Lincoln Park, and she let him say her name, and she noticed what she felt, which was very little. Not numbness, not avoidance. The specific quality of something that has lost its power to destabilize you. He had said her name Mags. He used to call her Mags. 2 years ago he had stopped, and lately in these calls and messages it was Maggie, the full name, as though he was aware that the intimacy of the shortened version had lost its license and it had no purchase. "Winston," she said. "I need you to understand something," he said. "All right, it didn't have to go this way." He paused. "I didn't want this." "What way did you want it to go?" she asked, genuinely. She was actually asking. He paused for a long time. "I thought I had arranged things so that you would be provided for. There were structures in place that would have Winston," she said. "The structures you arranged were designed to give me the minimum you could legally offer in a scenario where I wouldn't know to contest them. That's not providing for me. That's managing my exit." Silence. "I thought you wouldn't." He started. "You thought I wouldn't read the agreement," she said. "You thought I had stopped being a lawyer. You thought the woman who attended your galas and signed your foundation documents and managed your relationships was the whole of what I was." She paused. "You were wrong about me from the beginning." A longer silence. "I miscalculated," he said, quietly. "You did." Another silence. She could hear him breathing. She thought about what it cost him to say that. Not much, probably. Less than she might have once imagined. The capacity for self-awareness was not his strongest quality. "Is there anything?" he started. "Theo handles everything," she said. "That hasn't changed." She ended the call. She put the phone on the counter. She turned the burner back on. She finished making dinner. The Dignity Win Justice Variations 1. She ate at the desk with the window and looked at the street below and did not think about the call for the rest of the evening. She thought about the dinner, which was good. The time. She had her mother's heavy hand with time. She thought about whether she wanted to watch something after dinner or read. She thought about the rocking chair. She thought about very little else. That was the dignity win. Not a dramatic moment. Not a scene. Just a woman in her own apartment eating dinner she made herself after ending a call on her own terms. The absence of drama was the point. She had spent 6 years inside a life that had required constant management, constant performance, constant calibration of herself against his needs and the needs of his world. She was done performing. She was just living now. Living was enough. It was in fact more than enough. Validation whisper 10. She washed her dishes. She stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the darkening street. "Starting over feels impossible," she said. She said it to herself, to the window, to the steam from the dishwater. And then it doesn't. It just feels like starting. She paused. Which is enough. That's actually enough. Eleanor Grace Calloway arrived on a Thursday morning at 7:42 in the second week of April. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. She arrived with noise, the specific, alarming, entirely healthy noise of a newborn asserting herself into the world, and then, after a moment, a silence that was somehow more significant than the noise. The brief held-breath silence of a room registering something new. And then the nurse said, "Here she is," and placed her, and Maggie looked down. She had been told this moment would be transformative. She had been told, by people who loved her and by books she had read, and by the particular culture that surrounds pregnancy, that this was a moment that would change everything. She had listened to this with the same slight skepticism she applied to most categorical claims about emotional experience. She was wrong to be skeptical. It was not a lightning bolt. It was not a dramatic swell of feeling she could have described in a single word. It was something more specific and more absolute. The specific reality of a person, this complete and distinct person who had been moving and kicking and rolling for months, and who was now outside of her in the light with a face. The face. Eleanor had a face. She had her mother's hands. Maggie saw this immediately, the specific proportion of the fingers, the shape of the nails. She had Caroline's nose. Maggie could see it even now, the particular turn of it, the shape that would become more defined over time. She had something in the jaw that Maggie could not place immediately, and then, a second later, could. Reed. That was Reed's jaw or something like it. She had, as far as Maggie could determine, absolutely nothing of Winston Hargrove. She knew this was probably not biologically accurate. She held Eleanor and looked at her face, and she knew it anyway. This was hers, entirely, completely, unambiguously hers. Caroline was in the room. She had been there since midnight. She had not complained about any of the 14 hours that had passed since midnight. She had made friends with the nurses, had learned their names, had asked the right questions, had found a way to be present and useful without being in the way in the specific method of a woman who had spent a career in a room with 26 children at once and understood how to make herself necessary without making herself large. When the moment was over and things had settled and Eleanor was wrapped and breathing and entirely herself, Caroline held her. She did not say much. She said the things you say, "Look at you, oh, look at you," but what Maggie could see from where she lay was not the words but the quality of the attention. The way Caroline held her. The absolute focus of it. Like someone trying to memorize, she was talking to Eleanor. Too quietly for Maggie to hear fully. Not a performance. A private introduction. The world as Caroline knew it, offered to someone who had just arrived in it. Maggie watched and she felt something she did not have a clean word for. Something in the territory between joy and grief and love, and the particular ache of realizing that what you have has always been more than you knew. That the things you almost lost, the things you came very close to losing, by allowing yourself to be gradually diminished in a life that was not really yours, were right here, were real. Were these three names in a hotel room notepad. Nora, Reed, Caroline. Were the soup and the granola bars and the 9-hour drive and the 7.5-hour drive and the tote bag with the change of clothes and the printed bio page. Were all of it. Were more than enough. Reed? Reed was in the hallway. This was his choice, offered before they arrived at the hospital, stated simply, "I'll be in the hallway." She had not argued. He was a man who knew his limits, and she had always respected this about him. The nurse went to tell him. She heard through the door the sound of her brother sitting down in a chair. She heard, or imagined she heard, she was not sure, the specific sound of someone putting their face in their hands for a moment. Of a man doing the thing men do when they feel something very large that they do not have immediate language for. Then she heard him stand up. Footsteps, looking for coffee. He would find the worst coffee in the building and get it for himself, and then find better coffee elsewhere for her. And he would show up with both and present the better one without comment. This is who he was. This was exactly who he was. Nora. Nora came in when invited. She had been in the hallway too, not because she could not have been in the room. She was a pediatric nurse. Rooms like this were her professional habitat, but because she had understood without being told that this particular room needed a particular configuration of people and that her place in it would come at the right time. She came in and she held Eleanor with the practiced confidence of her profession, and she looked at Maggie and she said, "She's perfect." "I know," Maggie said. "She has your hands, I know. And your mother's nose, I know." Nora smiled. Then she laughed a small, real, uncomplicated laugh. And then Maggie laughed too. For the same reason and for no reason and for every reason at once. The two of them laughing in a hospital room in April with a newborn who had her mother's hands and her grandmother's nose and who had absolutely no interest in any of it yet and was simply completely herself. Breathing room, the birth, after. After the nurses and after Nora and after the footsteps in the hallway, she asked everyone to give her a moment. Just a moment. They went. She was alone with Eleanor. The room was quiet in the specific quality of hospital. Quiet, not silent. There was the machinery of the place, the background hum of a building doing its work but quiet in the sense of being still, of not requiring anything. She held Eleanor. Eleanor was asleep. She had made her announcement and determined that the world was for now acceptable and had gone to sleep with the absolute conviction of someone who has no experience yet of sleep being difficult. She slept with her whole self, her whole small face at rest. Maggie looked at her. She did not make a speech. She did not narrate the moment. She did not try to fix it in words. She just held her and looked at her and breathed. The hospital window, morning light. April in Chicago, pale gold, slanted through the glass at the particular angle of early morning when the sun is still low. It fell across the bed, across Eleanor, across Maggie's hands. She sat in the light and breathed and held her daughter and did not think about anything in particular for 20 minutes. Just this. Just exactly this. This is the beginning, she said, quietly, barely above a whisper. Eleanor slept. I know it in the way you know true things. Not because someone told me, because I can feel it. She paused. This morning, this window, this girl. Another pause. This is the beginning, not the end. She held her. Outside, the city was waking up, 3 months later. Eleanor was sleeping in the corner of Maggie's office, the corner that was technically the second bedroom, but had been rearranged since birth to include, alongside the crib and the changing table, a small desk where Maggie had discovered she could work while Eleanor slept if she kept her voice low and her coffee close. She was a mother. She was also tentatively a lawyer again, not in the formal sense. She had not returned to a firm. She had taken one consultation call in March, Maggie, from Patricia, who was looking for someone to review a contract dispute with a former business partner, and then another, and then another. She was not practicing. She was considering. She was keeping one toe in the water of who she had been before, and discovering that the water was warm and familiar and that she knew how to swim. The settlement had been reached in the 3rd week of May. It had not been fast. It had not been clean. It had been, as Theo had promised, expensive and slow, with filings and responses and negotiations and a mediation session that lasted 7 hours in a conference room that did not have enough windows. She had sat in that room for 7 hours and she had not performed anything. She had sat there and let Theo speak on her behalf, and she had listened carefully, and she had said, when asked for her position, exactly what her position was with the precise and practiced language of someone who knew how legal proceedings worked. The prenuptial agreement had been declared unenforceable by the court on grounds of inadequate independent representation. This ruling was being appealed, because everything in proceedings this complex was appealed. But it was the basis from which the settlement negotiation had proceeded. The settlement was not everything. It was not the number she had originally hoped for in the early days when she was running on adrenaline and reading paragraph 8.3 at 3 in the morning. It was a fair number, a genuinely fair number. Arrived at through a process that had been, in its own exhausting and sometimes brutal way, the legal system operating as the legal system supposed to operate when someone with documentation and a good attorney asked it to do so. Eleanor's future was secured. This was the part that mattered most. A trust, irrevocably funded, not connected to any Hargrove capital structure, held independently for Eleanor's education and long-term well-being. Maggie had insisted on this as a non-negotiable condition from the first negotiation session. Marcus's future, she had asked about this. Theo had raised it with opposing counsel. It was technically not her negotiation to have. But she had asked anyway, and she had been told that separate arrangements had been made, and that Delia's attorney had been involved, and that both children would be provided for. Both children. She had asked because Eleanor deserved it and Marcus deserved it, and the children were not parties to any of this. They had arrived in a mess of adult choices, and they deserved to have their futures separated from that mess as cleanly as possible. The Empire win and Legacy win justice variations. She was sitting at the small desk in the corner of the second bedroom, Eleanor asleep 6 feet away when Theo called with the final confirmation. It's done, he said. Executed. The funds are transferred. The trust is established. The prenuptial agreement for purposes of this proceeding is settled. She sat with the phone in her hand. She looked at Eleanor. 7 pounds, 4 ounces 3 months ago. Now considerably more. A person with opinions about everything, who had discovered her hands 2 weeks ago and had not stopped looking at them since, who made a sound in the morning that Caroline called her overture, and Reed called the alarm that actually works. Thank you, Theo, she said. You did most of this yourself, he said. We did it together. A pause. I hope you know, he said, that returning to practice would not be a loss for anyone who retained you. I'm thinking about it, she said. She hung up. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her hand. Maggie laughed. A small private laugh, the kind that comes without warning and doesn't require an audience. That's right, she said. Take inventory. She went for a walk that afternoon. The lake. The path. June in Chicago, the best possible version of this city. Warm and green and alive with people who had been waiting since February for permission to be outside. The path was full. Runners, cyclists, families with children, people with dogs. People alone sitting on the benches looking at the water with the particular expression of people who came to the lake on purpose, for the specific reason of sitting with a large amount of water and not being required to do anything about it. She walked slowly. Eleanor was at home with Caroline, who was visiting for the week, and had commandeered the apartment kitchen with such efficiency that Maggie had simply stopped trying to cook anything and had found herself eating very good food 3 times a day. She walked and she looked at the lake and she breathed. A woman about her mother's age with a dog. They caught each other's eyes and both smiled the small, sufficient smile of strangers who share the path in the evening and have no other claim on each other. She kept walking. She thought about the last 4 months, about what they had cost and what they had produced and what they had changed. The cost had been significant. Not primarily financial, the settlement was fair, the financial future was clear. The cost had been personal. The energy, the time, the sustained attention required to hold your own life together while simultaneously dismantling the parts of it that had been built on a false foundation. She was tired. She was also not the same person who had walked out of a rooftop ballroom in February in a navy gown that someone else had chosen. She was, actually, better. That felt strange to say. Strange to think. She did not want to romanticize what had happened. She did not want to make a story in which the suffering was secretly worthwhile, in which all the years of gradual diminishment were somehow necessary for her arrival at this particular lake path in June. They weren't necessary. They were just what happened. But she had come through them and she was here and she was more herself, more specifically and completely herself than she had been in years. Maybe more than ever. That was real. She was going to allow it to be real without qualifying it to death. She kept walking. Fifth engagement moment, final wisdom. She stopped at the edge of the path where there was a bench. She sat on it. She looked at the lake. She had spent 4 months waiting to feel safe before she acted. Waiting until the legal situation was clearer. Waiting until she was sure. Waiting until she had processed enough, healed enough, understood enough. She had been waiting her whole marriage, actually. Waiting until it felt safe to be herself. Until he was in a good mood. Until the timing was right. Until the children they kept almost having but never quite having were here. Because then things would be different. She had been waiting for the door to open and she had not understood, until she read paragraph 8.3 at 3 in the morning, that the door had been unlocked for years. She had been her own warden. Not the only one. He had built the prison. She had stayed inside it. Both things were true. But she was not staying anymore. She had not been waiting since the morning she woke up in a hotel room after the night of the gala and stood at the window and said, okay, she had been moving since then. Even when the moving was slow. Even when the moving was painful. Even when she did not know where it was going. You walk to the lake even when it's cold, she thought. You figure out the coat on the way. She looked at the water. Then she stood up. She kept walking. The restaurant encountered the dignity win in full. The last time she spoke to Winston directly was not planned. She was at a restaurant on the north side with Caroline and Nora in the second week of June. A small Italian place that Nora had been recommending for 3 years, and that Maggie had finally made a reservation at, a celebratory dinner for no reason, except that Eleanor was 3 months old, and Caroline was in town and it was Tuesday, and sometimes those things are enough. They had ordered. They were talking about the pigeons on Nora's building, which had apparently escalated their territorial program. Caroline was saying something about a recipe. Maggie was listening. She saw Winston before he saw her. He was at the bar. With someone she didn't recognize, a man, professional, probably a business contact. He had a drink. He looked like Winston, well-dressed, composed, the posture of a man who was accustomed to being in rooms. He looked a little smaller than she remembered. She noted this without satisfaction, just as observation. Then he looked up. He saw her. He sat for a moment. Then he came to the table. He stood at the edge of it. He looked at Eleanor in the carrier beside Maggie's chair, looked at her the way you look at something you understand you have no claim to, and yet cannot quite stop looking at. She could see him looking. She did not move Eleanor. She did not shield her. She simply sat and watched him look. She's beautiful, he said. Yes, Maggie said. He looked at Maggie. Something in his face that she recognized and did not need to name. The expression of a man confronting the specific shape of what he had thrown away, and the further specific shape of the fact that it had kept going, kept living, kept building, kept becoming without him. Maggie, he said. Winston, she said. Not coldly, not warmly. with the specific, clean neutrality of someone who no longer has anything to fear from this encounter and who is not performing the absence of fear because the absence is real. He nodded once. He looked at Eleanor one more time. Something in that look, she did not know what to do with it, and she did not have to do anything with it. It was his. It belonged to him. She had her own things. He went back to the bar. Caroline, who had been watching all of this with the contained expression of a woman who has been waiting 6 years to see this exact moment and who is not going to make it about herself, said, "You all right?" "Yes," Maggie said. She meant it. She was. She picked up her menu. She ordered the pasta. She ate it, and it was excellent. And she told Nora she should have made this reservation 2 years ago. And Nora said, "I tried," and Caroline said she really did try, and Maggie said, "Okay, that's fair," and they all laughed, and the restaurant was warm, and the pasta was good, and Eleanor slept in the carrier through the whole of it, entirely unimpressed by the proceedings. 3 months after the settlement, late summer, Eleanor was 6 months old and had discovered, in the last 2 weeks, that she could roll over. This had immediately become her primary project. She rolled, examined the ceiling, expressed an opinion about the ceiling, rolled back, repeated the process. She conducted this research with the focused intensity of a person who has found her current scientific question deeply compelling and has no interest in being distracted from it. Maggie watched her from the floor of the living room, where she had been sitting in the good light from the east window, reading a case file that Patricia had sent her. She was working. Officially, professionally working. Not at Patricia's firm that was in the future, possibly, still being discussed. As herself. Under her own name, as a consultant, reviewing contracts, offering legal opinions, doing the work she had always known how to do and had put away in a drawer and was now taking back out. The drawer, it turned out, had been unnecessary. The work had been waiting. It was still there. It had not diminished in quality while she was away. If anything, she was better at it. 6 years of watching financial structures from inside one of the most complex ones in the city had given her a perspective that she had not had at 29. She understood things now that she had understood abstractly then. She understood, in her body, in her lived experience, exactly how a legal instrument could be shaped to benefit one party while appearing to protect both. She did not plan to let that knowledge go to waste. The rug had arrived in July. She had gone back to the market on the Saturday after the settlement and found Ruth and bought the rug warm colors, wool, a pattern that was older than both of them. Ruth had wrapped it in brown paper. She had carried it home. She had unrolled it in the living room and stood looking at it, and then Eleanor had reached her arms toward it with the specific authority of an infant who has registered a preference, and Maggie had put her down on it, and Eleanor had immediately attempted to eat a corner of it, and the rug had become instantly and completely theirs. The second bedroom was finished. The changing table, the dresser, the rocking chair, simple, wood, the kind that would last long enough for Eleanor to sit in herself one day. Something on the walls, prints of animals, a soft bear, a drawing Nora had made of a small yellow bird that Maggie had framed and hung above the crib. The walls of the living room still had one bare corner. She was in no hurry about it. She had learned that incomplete things were not emergencies. They were just things that were not yet finished. The morning she woke at 6. Not from Eleanor. Eleanor slept until 6:30 most days, with the reliability of a person who has developed consistent habits and intends to maintain them. She woke on her own. The particular quality of early summer light in the east-facing windows of the third-floor apartment. She lay in bed for a moment. She looked at the ceiling. Her ceiling, plain white. Not the high ceilings of the penthouse with their architectural details. Just white, just a ceiling. Hers, she pushed herself up. She padded to the kitchen. She made coffee the right amount, the right temperature, the brand she had gone back to after a year of his preferred brand, the brand that had been hers for 12 years before the marriage, and that she had returned to like a person returning to a language they thought they had forgotten, and discovering it was still entirely fluent. 1 cup. She took it to the window. The street below in the early morning. The light just beginning on the buildings across the way. A runner. A delivery van. A woman walking a dog. The ordinary, extraordinary machinery of a summer morning in a city that did not require anything of her except to exist in it. She drank her coffee. She thought about the day. It was a Tuesday. She had a consultation call at 9, a new client, a referral from Patricia, a woman in a situation that she recognized in the way you recognize something you have personal knowledge of from the inside. She had 2 more calls in the afternoon. She had a walk planned with Nora at noon and Eleanor in the carrier. She had dinner with Reed on Thursday, his last night in the city before he drove back to Pennsylvania. He had been here for 3 weeks this time. He would be back. He was always back. This was her day. These were her plans. made by her for reasons she had chosen, in service of a life that was entirely and specifically her own. Eleanor's mornings at 6:32, Eleanor announced herself, not with crying, with the escalating sound that Caroline called her overture and Reed called the alarm that actually works. A preliminary signal that she was awake and had findings to report. Maggie went to her room. Eleanor was on her back, looking at the mobile above the crib with the concentrated expression of a scientist reviewing data. She looked at Maggie. She made the sound that, yes, good, you're here, I have things to tell you. Maggie picked her up. She took her to the window. The same window she had stood at on the first night, the one that faced the courtyard. The courtyard that had been snow when she moved in and was now green and slightly overgrown and wonderful. The garden at the courtyard fence had come in. Something purple, she did not know enough about plants yet to name it, but she was going to learn. That was on her list, something purple that swayed when the morning breeze moved through the courtyard. Eleanor looked at the window. With the absolute seriousness of a person learning about light, about the fact that it moved, about the fact that the same window could look different at different times of day, about the endless variety of something as apparently simple as morning. Maggie looked at it too. The light on the courtyard, the purple flowers, the ordinary June morning in Chicago doing its ordinary things. She held Eleanor and felt her small weight and her small warmth, and the specific reality of her, the particular aliveness of a person who was entirely new and entirely themselves. Breathing room the final, she stood there for a while. Eleanor watched the light. The mobile turned. The purple flowers moved. She could smell the coffee still on the counter. She could smell Eleanor's particular smell, clean and warm and specific, a smell she had learned in the first hours and that she would know for the rest of her life. She could feel the morning air through the slightly open window. Cool still, the cool that would burn off by 9. Eleanor made a sound. Maggie said nothing. She held her, she breathed, the courtyard below, the light moving across the garden fence, the purple flowers. She stood and held her daughter and breathed and looked at the morning. Caroline arrives. Caroline knocked at 7:15. She had a key. Maggie had given her a key in June, after the second consecutive visit when Caroline had stood in the hall with bags of groceries while Maggie was on a call that ran long, and they had both decided this was inefficient. She came in. She looked at Maggie at the window with Eleanor. She did not say anything for a moment. She put her bags on the counter. She came and stood beside Maggie and looked out the window. She's going to sit up soon, Caroline said. I know. You'll blink and she'll be sitting up. Then walking. She shook her head. I blinked and you were walking, and I never fully recovered. You recovered fine. I'm still not recovered. I just hide it better. She looked at Eleanor. She has your mother's nose. She has your nose, Mom. I know, Caroline said. I said your mother's. Maggie looked at her. Caroline was looking at Eleanor with the specific expression of a woman who is doing a kind of mathematics, who is counting the generations, who is placing this small new face in a long line of faces she has known, and who finds the placing of her both comforting and astonishing. You did good, Caroline said. Not the gala, not the legal proceedings, not any specific thing, just you did good. The whole arc of it. We all did, Maggie said. The final call from Theo the Freedom Win at 8:30, while Caroline was making breakfast and Eleanor had retired to the rug to conduct further rolling research, Theo called. One more thing, he said. I thought we were done. We are done with the proceeding, he said. This is something else. A pause. The Illinois State Bar has completed its review of the Whitmore complaint. It's been entered into the formal record. It won't produce any new professional sanction, he's already disbarred, but it is now part of the public disciplinary record associated with the Hargrove prenuptial matter. She sat down on the couch. Okay. The reason this matters, Theo said, is that any future proceeding, any challenge, any appeal, anything that attempts to relitigate the prenuptial agreement now has to contend with a public ethics record that formally documents the inadequacy of your representation at signing. He paused. He cannot come back to this without that record being part of the record. He's built a wall he cannot get through. She looked at Eleanor on the rug, who had rolled successfully and was regarding the ceiling with satisfaction. Good, she said. Yes, Theo said. Good, a pause. And Maggie, for what it's worth, I think you should practice again. I'm thinking about it. Good. Think faster. She could hear the smile in it. Minimal. Professional. Real. She hung up. She looked at Eleanor. Your mother, she said to Eleanor, is thinking about going back to work. Eleanor expressed an opinion. It was unclear whether the opinion was positive or negative, but it was decisive and conveyed with feeling. I'll take that as encouragement, Maggie said. The last confrontation echoed the quiet win. Reed arrived at 7 for dinner on Thursday. He brought wine she could not drink because she was still nursing, and beer for himself and sparkling water for her, and a box of chocolates he announced were for the baby, and which she and Caroline ate half of after Eleanor went to sleep. They ate at the table in the living room, the table that was slightly too big for the space, but that she had bought anyway, because she wanted a table you could actually have people around, a table that had room for 4 people without any of them having to hold their elbows in. Caroline made the soup. Reed argued about the salt. She added more. After dinner, Caroline fell asleep in the recliner that Reed had found on a marketplace application and that had been added to the apartment in June on the grounds that Caroline needed somewhere to sit that was not the couch. Eleanor fell asleep in the carrier on the couch. Maggie and Reed sat at the table with the last of his beer and her sparkling water and the remnants of dinner. "You good?" Reed asked. She looked at him. The canvas jacket, the crooked collar. The man who had driven 9 hours without being asked and built a crib and found an apartment and stayed 3 weeks at a time without complaint. "Yes," she said. "I'm good." He nodded. "I mean it," she said. "I'm actually good." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the room, the rug from Ruth, the lamp, the window with the evening dark outside, Caroline in the recliner, Eleanor on the couch, the second bedroom down the hall with the mobile and the rocking chair and the prints of animals. "I know," he said. "I can see it." He picked up his beer. She picked up her water. They sat in the comfortable quiet of people who do not need to fill every space with words. After Reed left and Caroline had been shown to the guest room and Eleanor had been moved to the crib, with minimal disturbance, Maggie stood in the second bedroom doorway. The mobile turning slowly. Eleanor's face, deeply and absolutely asleep. The rocking chair, the rug, the window. She had stood in this doorway before, when the room was incomplete. When she had written on the hotel notepad things still to add, she had added them, one by one over weeks and months. Not all at once, not in a rush to finish. At the pace of a person who was also simultaneously doing 100 other things and who was building a life rather than decorating a concept. The room was complete now. She was not done. She knew that. She would never be done, not in the way that meant finished, the way that meant no more work. She had a legal career to rebuild, or to build into something new. She had a daughter who was going to need things she could not yet anticipate. She had friendships and relationships in the ongoing project of being in a life, rather than observing one from a careful distance. She was not done. But this room was complete, and she had made it, and Eleanor was in it, and that felt like exactly enough for this moment on this night in this year. She looked at the mobile. The small wooden birds, turning in the slight draft from the window. She looked at Eleanor. She breathed. She was not afraid of what came next. That was the thing she wanted to name, standing in the doorway. She had been afraid for so long. Afraid of knowing. Afraid of looking. Afraid of the specific cost of being fully herself inside a life that had been built to contain a smaller version. She was not afraid now. Not because everything was resolved. Not because the future was clear. Not because the legal matters were completely done, or the career was rebuilt, or the apartment was finished, or Eleanor was going to sleep through the night reliably, which she was decidedly not. None of that was why. She was not afraid because she had been through the floor of this particular darkness. She had sat on the bathroom tile at midnight in a hotel room in February, in a $4,000 dress she had not chosen, and she had understood the full weight of what she was in, and she had not broken under it. She had made a list. She had called a lawyer. She had let her brother drive 9 hours and her mother drive 7, and her friend come with a tote bag full of exactly the right things. She had come through. And on the other side of it, not beautiful or easy or without cost, but on the other side was this room, this child, this life, this version of herself, the real one, the one that had been waiting in a closed room for 6 years. She was home. The final morning, the new horizon. Eleanor woke at 6:29. The overture. The escalating series of sounds that was not yet crying it was simply Eleanor announcing that she was here, she was awake, she had thoughts, and she felt it was appropriate that someone come and receive them. Maggie was already awake. She had been lying in the morning quiet listening to the birds outside. There were birds in the courtyard now. She had discovered this in June, small brown ones she could not name. Another thing for the list and waiting for this particular sound. She got up. She went to the room. She picked Eleanor up. She took her to the window in the second bedroom that faced the courtyard. The lake was not visible from here, but the courtyard was. The courtyard in late summer, full and green and purple, and alive with the particular aliveness of a thing that has reached its fullness. The garden at the fence, the purple flowers. The trees at the courtyard edges, heavy with late summer leaf. The specific dense green that August produced before September reminded everything that it would end. Eleanor looked at the window. The light came in sideways, the way it came in the morning, catching the edges of things. The edge of the mobile, the edge of the crib, the edge of Eleanor's face. Maggie looked at it too. She breathed in, out. Eleanor made a sound, a small, contented sound, the sound of someone who has found the window and the light acceptable and who is settling in for the experience. Maggie held her. She breathed. She looked at the courtyard in the morning. Below, the city was doing its morning things. A dog walker, a runner, the delivery van that came to the building across the street every Tuesday at 6:40 with the reliability of something reliable. The small mechanics of a morning that did not know or care about the year that had passed, or the months of legal proceedings, or the night at a rooftop gala when she had walked out without running. The morning was just a morning. Ordinary, warm, available. She was here in it. Completely. Specifically, irreducibly herself. She thought about the year. Not the whole of it, not in a summary she was done summarizing her own experience for other people's understanding. She thought about the specific quality of it, the specific temperature of it, the way it had felt on her skin moving through it. February to August, cold to warm. The hotel room on the 14th floor to the apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with a courtyard and birds. She had been afraid, and she had been angry, and she had been devastated, and she had been astonished by the specific faithfulness of 3 people who drove long distances without being asked and brought tote bags full of exactly the right things. She had been tired in a way she could not fully describe, and she had sat on bathroom floors, and she had read legal documents at 3 in the morning, and she had cried in the specific private way of someone who had been keeping the crying for the right moment. And she had come out the other side. Not the same, not unmarked, but herself. More herself than she had been in years. Eleanor looked at the window. Maggie held her and looked at it too. Okay, she said. She said it the way she had said it in the elevator on the night of the gala. The way she had said it in the hotel room on the first morning. The way she had said it standing at Theo's office door and in the Lincoln Park apartment and at the lake in April and in the doorway of this room when it was incomplete. She said it the way she had learned to say it, not as a performance of readiness, not as an assertion she needed to make convincingly, just as a fact. Simple. True. She was okay. She was ready. Whatever came next, the legal appeals that would wind their way through the system without her urgent attention. The career that was slowly, deliberately reassembling itself, the daughter who was 6 months old and rolling over and regarding the world with the concentrated seriousness of someone who had serious things to assess whatever came next, she was ready for it. Not because she knew what it was, because she knew who she was. That was different. That was the thing she had lost and found and was not going to lose again. The knowledge, specific and earned, of her own name, of her own face in a mirror, of her own capacity, methodical and real, to read the document and find the clause and make the list and call the people and stay through all of it herself. The morning came in through the window. Eleanor looked at it with absolutely total attention. Maggie smiled. Come on, she said. Let's have breakfast. She turned from the window. She carried her daughter into the morning.